All right. Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Hey, it's Alex, and welcome to I guess the remake to a series that I'd already started, but with recent changes to Gdevelop, we need to review the content and look at those changes from a newbie perspective. So, if any of you are joining late, I apologize. Joining this after stream or joining us for the first time, welcome. I'm sorry for the early or the late start there. I wish I had a timer or something to let you guys know when I'm coming back. But with all of that being said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are. Again, my name is Alex, and I am here to teach you how to use Gdevelop. Hey, Riley. We're going to be reviewing how to install Gdevelop and getting started from the very first time, how to use variables and what those look like inside of the engine now, and how to make those calls, and just some really early basics in game skill building for Gdevelop. Gdevelop is a no-code engine, and I very much look forward to taking you through that journey. For some of you again, and for some of you for the first time. So let's get down to business and let's start discussing the very beginning of Gdevelop. So you can come over to Gdevelop and download it if you go to gdevelop.io, G for game, develop.io, and you can just go to the download section. It works on mobile, it works on Linux, Mac, you can get it from the Windows Store, but we're going to download it directly for Windows right here. If you don't have that capacity, you can also just launch the app. It works perfectly inside of the web browser. It is written in a few different languages, but most of them all focused on web. So JavaScript, as well as HTML, and we got lots of CSS in here. And some C inside of the engine itself, I believe. So anyways, we're going to jump into it with the clicking here with the Windows download. And I'm going to go ahead and put that on my desktop. So as of right now, let's see here. Well, if you don't have it installed on Linux, you can just use it inside of the web browser, Riley. That's the benefit of Gdevelop being so lightweight and universal because it's a web language. So you can just download it or launch it straight from the web and it would be the same. And if not, for those that need help installing it on Linux, they have Flatpak support, which is right over here on the right-hand side. This is pretty much universally available now on Linux, or you can download Flatpak through your terminal, but this would be where you would most likely deploy it. But if you don't have that, you can download the image zip style of Linux. I cannot remember how do, but you know. Okay, so we're on 5.4.205, though if you're joining us as anything after 5.4 where there's been some major changes, we're going to want to go and review those. So once you double click, you can install it for just yourself or anyone who uses the computer. If you're unsure about what to do, and or maybe you're not the main user of that computer, maybe you're you have your parents, you still live with your parents, and they it's a family computer or something. You may only want to run this for only me. So we're going to go ahead and run that for me. And once this installs, we'll be able to launch it. So it's very quick. Did it just install? Let's go find out. Go ahead and minimize this. And we put it on the desktop, so let's launch it again. Only for me. It's installed to the location. There we are. We're just going to let it be where I think I hit cancel when I went to go run that on accident. Now that it's installed, we can just click finish, and you'll see that it doesn't delete the install, and it added the icon to the desktop. So now that we are here for the first time, I am already logged in. You can see it up here. And if you're not, you should create an account and get logged in. I got some notifications, but the menu to navigate is pretty straightforward. On the left-hand side, at the top left, we have just some various things that we can investigate. I would say that I would begin in the build section after you get started, or rather in the not in the build, in the getting started section of getting started, right? Here we have a very quick breakdown on how to do some very basic things inside of Gdevelop, and this is a great place to get started for mobile developers and anyone who wants a guided journey. Now, what I mean by guided is they have pop-ups and little text boxes that kind of guide you through step by step in making whatever it is that they want you to do. And they kind of explain why in a really creative way. So if you have never done these, I highly recommend them. But that's today you have me, and so we're going to skip through some of that. We can do this together all at once. So we're going to start in the build section, and when we go into build, you'll be able to see ready-made projects that you can clone and buy. If they don't have a pricing, they're free. You can check out all these really cool things, including multiplayer co-op, 3D tile builders, and there's a plethora of other templates that you can investigate to learn from. But what we're going to do is create our first project, and we're going to stick to cloud saving at the moment. You can convert anything from the cloud or upload to the cloud, your game, pretty much at any point. So it's not a huge deal, but for some of you, maybe you're at a library, maybe you don't have accessibility to storage. We can definitely do that for free, after having a Gdevelop account. So now that you have an account and we're ready to roll forward, we'll just create a new project. And here we're going to put forward a desktop and mobile landscape form. This is in 1280 by 720. We're not going to go full desktop because we want to support that landscape mode. Maybe we want to make a game that's both mobile and PC related, tablet related. We would want to use a more default resolution that's a little bit smaller. This will also ensure that it just runs better on older PCs. So once we have selected that, which is pre-selected, we can name our project whatever we would like. And in this case, we're just going to do tutorial 01, and then we are going to optimize for pixel art, and we're going to disable allow players to authenticate in game. This is more of an advanced feature that has to do with leaderboards and the networking for multiplayer, and we can add this at any time, even if we don't start it with advanced files. Here we have the AI prompt. I don't use this. I've tried it a couple of times, and I'm going to be honest, it absolutely has never worked for me properly. I've been very descript. I've also been loosely scripted in the way that I've tried to post it. I've used all of my AI experience, and maybe you'll have better luck with me, better luck than me. However, we're going to leave that alone. So now that we have our tutorial and it's set, we're going to go ahead and create the project. Give it a second to load, and then you'll be loaded in to your first cloud project. So at the very beginning, this can be very overwhelming for people when they first get started. There's a lot of tabs now opened, as you saw, and there's just lots of buttons to get started. Where do we begin? What's important and what isn't important right now? Well, I don't want to close anything down yet, because I want you to see everything that they have intended, they being Gdevelop, the engineers, and company that have designed this. We want to see what they had intended us to see. And I think that the default layout, although a little cluttered, is really where you're going to spend most of your time. And a lot of these things, as we move forward, we'll be able to close. So looking at it from the very beginning, we have objects. And now objects are represented by the single cube. So we can close the objects panel or open it. And this is the objects. This is everything that exists in your game, on your game scene. We have object groups. And when we open objects, it rearranged my thing here, I think, but that's okay. And then we have object groups. So a parental group that assigns them all together. Now, if you're coming from another language and you've done grouping before, this works very differently than you would expect. So we're going to sort of skip over the in-depth use of object groups for this particular video, but just because when you add a group together, you can't add behaviors to it, which you don't know what that means yet for those that are just getting started. But groups are more of like a label than anything else, and that's represented by the stack of group panel, or the stack of objects here. So we're going to click that to actually get rid of it, because we won't be using it just yet, but we can go ahead and get that out of the way. And then we have the properties panel, which is this over here, and it's displayed by the pencil icon. Now, properties, for everything you create on what we're going to call your scene canvas, the layout of your canvas, anything you add to your game scene it becomes an instance of an object. So if we add multiple objects, each of them have their own identification, and each independently have their own settings. And so once you add something to the game, you'll be able to see its properties, like its X and Y location, as well as any other variables that are like its positioning, its size, and scaling. If you're coming from something like Unity, this is very much like the inspector tool for those properties. So we'll see more of this coming up. And for now, we're going to leave this open. It's one of the most used tabs in Gdevelop, I would say. And then we have a layers system, and there's a lot going on here in layers, because layers have more nuance than you might expect. They're not just layers. Layers in Gdevelop can have things like lighting effects and other attachments to it, which would allow you to modify and greatly change the visual representation of what you see in game or in engine once it's launched. And like CRT game effects and blooms and things of that sort, that would all be done through the layers tool. And so as we're looking into the layer, we can hide layers, we can lock it so we can't accidentally mess with it. And then these are the effects that I was talking about. And every layer begins with a 3D hemisphere lighting effect, and that sort of illuminates your game world in every way, all of the capacity. You don't really need to add any more lights unless your game specifically needs it. But it is important to know, because these things can overlap each other and create all sorts of different effects. You can add more of them, 2D and 3D effects. You can copy your effects and paste them on other layers. But overall, just know that this is your base properties for that layer. There's a lot more that we can go into in terms of base layer properties, but those are more advanced settings, and we're not quite ready to dive into those. So we're going to stop there. So now that we have our layers, we're going to leave this open because we will be using it for things like UI, and I'll explain how cameras work in a little while, and that way you can have a good representation and understanding of kind of how each of these components work in real time. Beyond that, we have the, and I wanted to just make sure as well that you understand that there's a couple tools that aren't listed or shown defaultly, which is the instances panel list. You remember how just a minute ago I was talking about adding objects and then becoming instances? Well, we have an instance list here, and we can kind of look through what we've added to find the objects that already exist in the game scene. Those unique IDs and object will be presented down here. We'll review that when we add some objects later. And then we have, of course, the layers panel, as we see it kind of generically represented by layers of like paper or something, a pretty common sort of icon for this setting. And then we have the toggle edit grid, which allows us to enable a grid on our game and lets us do snapping to grid. So if you want to be able to snap something to a grid, you need to set up your grid. And we're going to set up our grid not on 32 by 32, but instead on 16 by 16, which is a pretty common pixel scale size. And we're going to, after we set it, oh, my apologies, and we are going to show the grid. And now we can see each of those independent grids and what they look like on the layout. All right. So the sorry, I got a little distracted there. That was an important text message I had to look at. We have the undo and the redo button, we have the ability to fit our content into our window, or zoom into or back to the initial view with the zoom tool. We can fit all the content in, we can zoom in, zoom out, and if there is content, we can fit it into the selection. So if we select it, we can zoom in on that. And then here we have some game settings. This would be, so this is a scene. And actually, I think a good way to show you how and this works and what this looks like on Gdevelop. If you come over here to the project manager on the top far left, not the very top, that is the overall like settings, the tool menu for Gdevelop as a software. But right underneath it, there is a project manager. Now, the project manager, when you open it up, you can see that there's quite a few things going on here, but we were just talking about scenes. Now, a game scene in Gdevelop really is a external event and a external layout bound into one object. Now, that's a little confusing because you don't know either of these are yet. So let's re-explain this step by step. So an external layout is effectively this here, this canvas. What we see is a layout. Now, up here, we can see it says Untitled Scene Events. If we click on that, this is a event script. This is where all of the Gdevelop coding will go, the visual coding. And it's presented. We can add a new event. We can click on, when we add an event into our event sheets, we have conditions and actions. Conditions are triggers, and actions are things that happen once a trigger goes into effect. So if we click on the conditions, right now we have no objects in our game with no behaviors attached to them, which are guiding principles that allow objects to do various things via player input or user input. So moving a character around, a player object, anything like that would be an object in your game. And then we have other conditions that are reliant on the system, and they're pretty well organized, but not all of them are here. And so Gdevelop does kind of require you to play around a little bit to get used to where everything is. It comes with practice, so don't feel like you have to memorize all of these things, but you should know that in other conditions, we can look at some general things for our game, such as timers and time, scene, and variables. Now, scene has some pretty interesting things that we want to dive into here in a little bit, and we'll be using a lot of these. And so we want to make sure that you get a firm understanding of some of the user input, the cameras, and the general by the end of this video. So we're going to close this down because I want to show you what it looks like when you add an external event and an external layout. So we're going to just press the plus sign. We're going to leave it untitled for now, and we're going to do the same thing here. Now, if I double click on the game scene, it will open up both of these for me to edit. And I'm going to close these down and say you did close them down and you're working on your project. You can come back to the top left and then double click to open it back up. So we have untitled scene and scene events. Now, going back to our scene, and it doesn't really matter where you do this, I just like visually looking at this. We're going to click on the settings, the project settings again, and then we're going to double click, or single click in this case, on the external event. And on the external event, we see it's asking you to choose a game scene, which we would include this layout, or this event sheet rather. So we're going to choose a game scene. We're going to click on untitled scene, which is this one up here. That's just the only scene we have, and we're going to click choose. Now, when we do that, we can now see that it looks exactly like this one, and effectively they are the same thing. One of them is just bound to the main scene, or this particular scene, and so it's already included. But if you wanted to add more scripting or organize it in such a way that each script is its own page, you could definitely do that. And that's how I'd recommend doing it here. Now, you're going to want to know how to tie these together, because just because you told it to be attached to this, you still have to call its script into function if you want this to work. And we'll be reviewing that here in a little while. And the same thing will happen, though, if you go to external layouts. You click on external layouts, you click choose the scene, you go to the untitled scene, press choose, and now, as you can see, it's the same thing as the untitled, but you'll see that it doesn't have its own grid. which shows you that you can actually have different grid scales for maybe different layouts and different needs. There's a lot of use cases for these things, and we'll review those as we get to them. So going back to the untitled scene, I want to get you started with understanding some very core basic concepts with Gdevelop. So now that we understand the user interface panel, I've skipped over a few things in here because they really aren't necessary to digest right now. These are all advanced sort of things. The only thing that isn't really is the project settings for global variables and resources. And I'll explain how resources work actually right now. So when we go into Gdevelop, you are probably wondering, Alex, where do I begin to, how do I add something to my game? How do I start by getting the very first thing on the screen? Well, if we go over to our objects panel, and again, this is the little cube. If you've closed it, we can click it back open. We have global objects and we have scene objects. Now, a global object, for those that are unfamiliar with how globals work in most game engines, a global object is an object that can be accessible from any layout, regardless of whether they're bound together or not, because it's reserved for sort of the most used objects in all of your game. Now, this could be user interface related. This could be, there's 1,000 things that we can kind of use this for. Maybe our player object, we need to be persistent and not destroyed and reloaded across multiple game scenes. We could create a global object that would retain that information, or there's other variables. So global access means accessible from anywhere. And a scene object is exclusive to what you're looking at in here. So if it's not accessible in this game scene or in whatever we're doing here, it must be created as a scene object for that to happen. So this is how we do that. We go into add a new object, this purple button down here, maybe blue for some. And then now we're presented with a new object list. Now this is insane. Where do we begin? What do we use? How do we use it? There's a lot going on here, Alex. And that's true. There is a lot. And again, this comes from repetition. This comes from using it and deep diving the program every opportunity you get. And so we have some general things that you should probably know about when getting started. And also, one of the more important things that I would recommend for any beginner getting started in Gdevelop, or anyone looking to, to really understand the system, watch these tutorials. Most of them are done by Helper Wesley, and the guy knows his stuff, right? So, get into the each of these videos and get a solid fundamental breakdown of object types, how they work, and all of that good stuff. Now, this is a very basic introduction to object types, and I want to kind of, on a topical level, skim over that information. We won't watch that video, but if you'd like to, you totally can. Super easy to do. But we're going to talk about the most important, in my opinion, is the sprite feature. Now, a sprite is an animated object. It doesn't have to be animated, technically. It just has an animation timeline, if you'd like to use it, which can be used for most elements of the game, meaning anything that you put in the game that is an image, a picture, a texture of any degree is probably going to be a sprite. Now, we have tiled sprites, which are more used for tile sets and repeating textures like grass or flooring to some degree, or maybe a tiled background. And we'll get into how these work, because these are replicated sprites that are created over and over and over again as you stretch and scale. And that reduces things like stretch blur, where if you took a sprite, let's say you had a texture for grass and you uploaded it to a sprite, when you change the sprite size, it would cause the pixels to morph and blur as it got bigger, whereas a tiled sprite knows that once it reaches the same size as the upload, so let's say you uploaded a 16 by 16 tile, it would then replicate itself indefinitely without stretching or blurring. So that's what those are for. And 9 patches are more for user interface things, basically the infinitely scalable menus, and we'll get into those, but that is a far more advanced feature for someone looking to polish up their game and use that. So we're going to skip over these for now. We have input, which is multi-touch controller joystick. This is specifically for mobile stuff. And there is a high demand for this stuff, so it's included in the input. Now, keyboard is automatically, it's bound to a behavior that you can add to an object, which we'll talk about in a minute. So right built into Gdevelop, we have access to both of these, but you do have to add multiplayer and multi-touch, sorry, if you want to use it. It's not defaultly bound to the player sprite in the same sort of way. It's kind of confusing, but we'll get into that in a minute. And we have some texts, and we have different types of text that use various different We can use BB text, bitmap texts, and then regular text. Now, if you're using anything that's HD or of modern screen sizes, and we chose 1280 by 720, you can get away with using text. But as we reduce our canvas in our game size and say we're making something more retro or something that would emulate the graphics between a Nintendo, so like a regular Nintendo Entertainment System, so the NES, all the way up to the handhelds, Game Boys, and things of that sort. If you want to use and create your game into that same base canvas size of like 244 or so, then you want to create a bitmap text. But again, that's some pretty advanced stuff. We're going to skip over that for now. We have lots of user interface panels, input fields. You can use built-in toggle switches and sliders, as well as resource bars. So things like life, mana, ammo, that would all be done in here. Now we have more that we can dive into, but we're really getting away from that beginner-friendly start. So now that we see that we have all these options, the first one I want to dive into is a sprite. Now, when we add a sprite object, I'm going to create an empty object. So this has nothing in it. It's just a blank, transparent nothing, right? It's going to error out if I add it to the game. There's nothing in it. But we can make it blank if we want to. New sprite. We could call this player if we wanted to. Hero, anything. And now I'm going to do object underscore player. I use this naming convention whenever I'm dealing with big projects or anything I need to really organize into a single object. So object is what it's written as. Sometimes I'll do, let's see, sprite as well. So like SPR, if I'm just uploading a player texture that maybe will bind to another object later. But in this case, we're just going to stick with object, obj, and we're going to keep it all lowercase, obj underscore player. Here we can create our own character using Piskel. So we just create with Piskel if we wanted to. And we're introduced with a 32 by 32 canvas. We can change that very easily by going to 16 by 16. Make sure that we resize in the middle, click resize, and now we have a 16 by 16 canvas. Personally, I would not recommend using Piskel as a graphics editor. It will do if that's all you have, but there are other free options out there like LibreSprite. That would be what I would recommend for anybody. So LibreSprite as one of the free options, you have some flexibility in whatever you would like to use. But if this is all you have, and let's say we just want to do some player basic prototyping, this is where we might change this. Let's say this is the title of the picture that we're going to do. So maybe it's like sprite underscore idle, right? Maybe this is idle 0, the very first frame of our idle. So sprite underscore idle underscore frame 0. And we only have one frame for this character because we're just going to take a blue color. Any blue will do. We're just going to take the paint tool or bucket tool B, select a color by clicking on this, clicking on your color of choice, and fill that in. So now you can see here we have our animation, animation 0, and here is where those could be piled in. So if we had multiple frames for our character, they get added here. And we can preview their animation. He has no animation, or it has no animation. It's a blue cube, right? But if we wanted to see some other things, we could go to the asset store and search for items. We can also do that when we were creating. Let me hit apply here. But when we were creating the object here, we had an asset store that we could search through, and we're going to look for a character this way. I have some things that I've purchased, but there's lots of free options out there. And I think that we'll start with something simple here. Let's see. What's something that we can get easily started on? Looking for more of the platforming styles, or just some tiny characters in general. I guess the dinosaur characters would work for this. So we're going to start with the blue dinosaur. And you can see here that when we go to add it, it tells us its size. It's 24 by 24 sprite. So maybe we want to change our grid. I wouldn't personally, but you could. Yeah, we're already on 16 by 16, so that's close enough. Got to remember there's some extra space around this dinosaur for animation purposes. We can see the different animation types, or we can rotate it through like this. We can see that he can kick, move, sneak, idle. All right, so we're going to add this character to our game scene, and as you can see, it automatically did it over here, but there's no like real pop-up right now. Sometimes I can get like, if it depends on how fast your computer is. Mine, it does it so fast. So we now basically have two of the same thing. We can't name them the same thing, so in this case, we're just going to do object underscore dino. And I want to start by adding that dinosaur to our game. I'm just going to drag and drop our character in. Now, we have kind of an interesting thing happening here. If I click preview, now that we've added that character, it's going to just, I don't know if you can see that very well. Let's see if I can maximize this. The character is kind of sitting on the canvas. No input or anything like that. It's just work. I mean, it's just there. It's doing what you just told it to do. So Gdevelop has some really interesting elements that you will want to know about as a new user coming in for the first time. If you double click on your character, you can open, or any object in your objects list, you can open it up. Hey, Funk. Oh, we're doing all right. How are you, sir? And so we're going to go, now we can jump back in, or with being into the object dino, we can see that there's an idle animation, the crouch animation, the hurt, the kick, all the ones that we saw before. And you'll notice if you go over here to the right, they have some changes already done into their timers for animation. And we can see that this one's a 0.125. This is a 0.025. What does that mean? Let's click on preview, and we can see actually how those numbers translate directly into frames. So when you change it, let's say 14, we're going to click off of it. It automatically readjusts. We're going to go back to 8 frames a second, and we'll see that it changes over itself. So that's the animation speed. If you want to go faster or slower, you can modify that here. So we have those basic things in place already because we imported the dinosaur. This, though, is what it would look like as you add frames. You can see that we can rearrange our frames by holding it down and dragging over. We can also click on this and delete with a right click, or duplicate a different frame if we wanted to. That would be a good way to do some animation. So like if you had one frame and you drew one character, you could duplicate it, click on it, and then edit with Piskel. And once you do that, we can now go to the second frame. And now this, you'll see they both have the same title, and it's grayed out. We can't change it because it's going to overwrite that when we save it. So when we go to number 2, they're both the same picture. So if we saved over top of this with an overwrite, it would overwrite both of them because of the same picture. So what we want to do is go to new, and this is where we start adding in those animation frames. So in programming, we always start with 0. So this one would be crouch 0 if we wanted to, right? And then we would do this one as crouch 1. So for right now, I don't want to modify any of that. So I mean, it is based on which one you're currently editing. So because we changed this to like 0, right? This one, if we change it to 1, they're going to share the same name, and that's fine because we're focusing on what is in our preview. So crouch 1 is going to be this one. And then we could change something in our character here, and then that save would go into effect. And so that's how you kind of go through those steps of changing and adding in frames if you only have Piskel. But we're going to cancel that because I don't want to do anything to those frames at the moment. We're going to unselect these. Now we're going to go over into, you've heard me say it a few times, behaviors. Behaviors are features to an object that we can add to make it do complex things. Now this is where Gdevelop really shines as a no-code engine. So we can click on the behavior tab, and now we can see all of these behaviors that we can add to our character or add to an object in our game to do something unique, special, or to give it some advanced logic. Now, we're going to start with the, in my opinion, the simplest of the built-in mechanics is the platforming character mechanic. So we're going to add that by just clicking on that once, and it's going to bring us right into the behavior, and here it is. We can see it. You can click this arrow if you want to collapse it at some point. Maybe you have multiple, but here we can also, of course, review it with Wesley. But this will give you a very quick overview. I mean, it is a fairly in-depth. I'll be honest, but overall, it's a light glance into how the platforming mechanic works and how to get started. And there's extended videos that you can continue to watch if you're really interested to hear straight from Gdevelop on how to do that. Now, right out of the gate, there's a lot of settings that we can review. And most of them right now aren't very important until we start getting to the polish stage of our game or the map building, depending on how quickly you want to prototype. We have default controls enabled, which allows us to use the arrow keys on our keyboard. Space then becomes jump, and it's built right into this behavior. So you don't need to do anything to be able to now control this character and use it in your game. So we're just going to hit apply. Make sure you hit apply, because if you don't, it won't work. Okay? So now that we have our character here, I'm going to scale him up just to make him big. Now, this is not something you should do in your game if you're going to be continuing kind of the development of this. Stretching your character big is kind of what I was saying before about sprite objects being blurred and stretched as you change their size. So I was just showing you that we can do that, I guess, for a preview to kind of look at our character and make sure we can visually see them in this tutorial. But as you saw, when I pressed play preview this time, the character fell immediately. What happened? Well, we added a new behavior to the character. It adds gravity and other things like that to make the platforming character move. So we need a collision or some other object to stop the player from indefinitely falling, right? And so what we can do is, similarly to the object player, we can just click on it once, right-click on it, go to duplicate. Now we're going to change this to object collision, okay? Just going to duplicate it and then rename it to object collision. Now that we've done that, we can go into the object collision, go into the, we're just going to leave this blank, or if you leave it blank, you totally can do that if you want. My standard is just to name it default, so I know if I do target it via the name title, universally the first, if it only has one panel, default is what it is. But that's just my own naming convention. You could do it any way you want. In fact, you don't have to put anything there. It's totally fine. Now we're going to go into edit with Piskel, and here we want to not overwrite default. Instead, we want a new one, and then we're just going to name this picture collision. We're going to go to our bucket tool for B for bucket, go down into our color wheel, and select a red bright color. One of the things that I like to do with this as well is take on the line tool, the stroke tool, L, go to our colors again, and go back to black, and just give this a very quick outline. And then we're going to, using the shift key and the stroke pen tool, we'll go diagonally across, and now we have a red cube, and we're going to save that. As you see a little change here. There we go. Now that we have that, I want to show you something. We are going to drag this object into our game scene, and because it is 16 by 16, because we previously set that canvas size when we do with the player, we can now change this its size. Now, this again is what I was talking about with the collision and the sprites and tiled sprites. This does not look very good. We have this really blurry sort of object that, you know, it just doesn't look good for even for prototyping purposes. It's going to get messy really quickly. So what we're going to do instead is, because we've now created this resource, so this, everything you add to the game becomes a resource. And I said earlier we're going to talk about resources. Now I'm going to introduce how resources work. Now that we've added a few textures into our game, we can go to our resources tab and see all of the ones that we have in our game. And over time, if you add and delete things and overwrite, you're going to get a lot of junk in here. You can get rid of that by right-clicking, going into remove unused, and do any kind, or select whatever audio, you know, the audio or whatever object type maybe you need to select to clear out that junk. But because it's in here, collision is now a resource inside of our game. All right. So what that means is, even if I delete this object, which I'm going to do now, so we click on it, click the delete key, and click confirm. You can also right click on it or click on these white dots over here. Backspace works as well. And we're going to just click that to delete it. It says, are you sure you want to remove this object? This can't be undone. Yeah, I do. It's okay. It's gone. Even if I control Z, it's gone. There's nothing I can do about it now. If we go back into resources, we can see that we still have the collision box. All right. So now when we go into add back to our game scene and we add a new object, we can then go back to our new object from scratch and click on the tiled sprite. We can rename this to object collision now that we don't have it. And we can click on select an image. Now that we can choose an image, which would be straight from our computer, we can create a new image here. But what's better is that we've already created it. So click on select an image, scroll down, and click on your collision. It automatically adds it, and it will adjust the default width and height based on the picture once you hit apply, but we're just going to set it to 16 by 16. And now that we have that, and I stretch it, now you can see what I was talking about how tiled sprites work. They immediately duplicate themselves, and create a much more visual and clean way of displaying your sprite. Now, you could then, this also stops you from having to duplicate objects over and over again. So before we add any behavior to the collision object, I want to show you just a couple more things. So here we have the object collision, and on the left side, we have an instance of this object. Now, if I was to hold the Alt key and not Alt, my apologies, the Control key, click on it with Control, and drag your mouse away while holding Control down, and you'll duplicate the object. Now, there are two different objects instances. So this is an object, and like here, this is an object, right? A scene object. This is an object. These are two of the same object. However, they're different instances of an object, and instances can have different variables, including different object variables. So let's say we added a variable called that it's true and false, and we can change one to true and the other one will remain false under certain conditions. And this allows us to start building game logic based on collision or all sorts of different use cases, I suppose. And we'll get into how that works here in a little bit. But they all have one thing in common, though. They all do share their behaviors. So it doesn't matter how many instances of an object you have, they all inherit the same behavior. So in some ways, it's kind of like having a parent object, and in other ways, it's not. But we'll get more into detail about that here in a minute. So we're going to go into add a behavior. And in this case, we're going to add the platform behavior, not a platforming character, the actual platform behavior. When we click on it, we can, of course, review that video from Wesley, or we can go to, and which I do encourage you if this is your first time doing it. I think that the way that Wesley breaks it down and edits his videos is very digestible, and that's how I learned. So that aside, you can click on type, and you can see that we have different logic that different types of platforms that it innately has built into it. So if you wanted to jump through a platform, there you go. If you wanted a ladder, it automatically registers as a ladder no matter what its texture is, and that's kind of impressive, but it does it really, really quickly. So here we go. We're going to add just a platform type, and I'm going to disable ledges can be grabbed because I don't want that offset. I don't want that ability in my game. I want a retro style platformer for this tutorial. So now we're going to go into apply, and I'm going to show you that when we press preview, we'll now stand on that object. We don't fall through it anymore. Now I'm going to make it bigger so that we can move around a little bit. So let's do that. And there we go. So now using default controls, left, right, up, down on the arrow keys, they all work. Up and down don't do anything that you would be able to tell right now, and that's okay. And then we're going to, like, if we press space on the space key, we'll see our character jump. Well, now we have the basics of a very early platformer. And for some of you, this might be all the functionality you need to get started in your project. Now, you might want to customize how quickly your character moves, and all of those settings can be done from inside of the object itself. So going back into here, going to the behavior, we can check our jump speed, our fall speed, how long we can jump in the air. So let's say you hold this down with your thumb, or whatever, I guess, whatever you're using. If you hold down the space, the current key, which is space bar, this is how many seconds it'll sustain that jump. And so this will mean the longer you hold the button, potentially the peak of the jump, how high you can hold it before it resets or turns off. We have our ladder climbing speed. We can enable or disable platform grabs, which we are automatically have off. And then this is just some automatic settings for that. This doesn't matter. You can turn that off because we're not using it. And then down here, we have walk acceleration, deceleration, max speed, slopes, and whether or not we can go through platforms. There's some advanced properties, but they're depreciated. We don't need to worry about that. Depreciated means that they're no longer in use. Now, out of the gate, hitting apply, and reviewing again just sort of that behavior. So if I went without the collision behavior, your character would just fall through the platform. And you can duplicate items by dragging and bringing them in that way, because it is an instance of this object. So this is kind of the parent object, and this is the instance of that parent object on your game screen. We're going to add a couple of platforms just to add some spice and variety to our level. And I'm just using control left click now to do that. Let's say we'll add another one kind of up here, maybe. And we'll press preview and look at our game. So now we can jump, which I can't jump high enough to get on that platform, so we're going to rearrange that. But let's say maybe we come from a background of programming and we want to know a little bit more about how to navigate through. I'm going to shrink our character back down. Actually, I'm going to delete that character and bring in a new version of him, which is the original size. Press preview, and now we can see just how tiny he is. And now we can really see the jump distance based on his scale. The jump height and everything stays the same. It's just a small sprite, and so it makes it look like you can jump wildly, like just insane. I don't know who jumps like that, but that is it would make Mario jealous. But I got distracted with that. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So now that we kind of have a rudimentary display of our game, we want to start looking at like how variables work and how we can tie that into our game. I would say that the next most important thing to learn, other than how behaviors work and how to integrate them, is the actual scripting side, the quote-unquote scripting side, the no-code visual scripting that is the backbone of Gdevelop. So now that we have some basic rudimentary input from our character and some level design, we want to start let's polish this up a little bit. Let's get a little bit closer to our character when we play so that he doesn't look so small. And let's jump into a brief understanding of how to get started in the events. So we're going to close this down because we don't need that right now. We're going to go into our untitled scene events. And now anything that's tied to this scene, all of these objects will now be accessible inside of our conditions menu. So if you don't have this here, you can just click new event, shift and D, shift. Hello? We must need an event first. That's right. So if you have an event, you can click shift and D. That'll create a child. Shift A creates a new one that is not a child. This is kind of confusing, but we'll get into that. But create one by clicking add a new event. Now that we have an event, we can start adding stuff to our game. Now, clicking on the condition, we can now see those objects are available inside of the Gdevelop interface. So now we can click on the dinosaur character and then go into and see that now this object has conditions or behaviors that we never saw before. None of these were available here in the conditions as we looked at earlier. So now this is what happens when you add things to an object, and each object has so many different variables and things. Where do we get started? Where do we get started? Well, if you wanted to adjust your player's acceleration or deacceleration, which is available inside of the editor, going back into here, clicking on your character, see, we don't see it here in the instance, but if we click on edit object or double click, you could double click the object in the game scene. There's so many different ways to go about this, but if we go into behavior, we can see that these acceleration and deacceleration are part of the object's behavior. So what I'm saying is that in programming, we can contact those things. And let's say we wanted to be able to sprint holding the shift key. We would have to access that through our conditions to then set it and deset it, if you will, to turn it on or to modify it and then turn it off at different points. So we're going to get started with some very basics in our game. I want to teach you the foundation of how Gdevelop sort of operates its event sheets. Event sheets are run from the top down, and they run about one every frame of your game. So the bigger these events get, the longer it takes to load, and ultimately it will affect some of your FPS when you're designing your game. And so there's some things that we need to be conscientious about. How often does a code run? Well, again, because it runs top down and runs once per frame, that means that Gdevelop is effectively running the script at 60 times a second. And so if an object is left with no condition, there's no triggering event, then it will always run. So we need to set up and establish some ground rules for our program. So I'm going to start by right-clicking on this condition. We're going to go add. The only way to do this is by doing what I'm showing you now. And so again, right-click on the condition in the gray area over here on the edge. If you right-click inside, as long as it's not over top of the word, you'll be okay. So you can right-click on the gray, add, and we're going to add something called an event group. Now, this is just kind of a fancy way of saying a tab, like a tab in a folder, you know, like where you'd put the title of what you're working on. And so we're going to say on startup. Okay. And so on startup, you don't need to do anything special. You just say on startup. We now see that there's sort of this bracket system of how events are run. Anything drug underneath this becomes a child of the group. Now, tabs is just sort of an organization method. An event group is an organization method. So we're going to run all of our on startup programming right here. And because before we get started too far, we can Control C or copy, right click, copy, and then right click and paste, and it'll paste this event group multiple times. And it'll keep it exactly as it is. So just so that we can kind of do some base foundation, let's copy and paste it. And we're going to have on startup, and then this is on runtime. So during runtime, or you can call it just runtime. I have a habit of adding the parentheses. We're just going to call it runtime for now. And so, or you can say, so runtime, I can add some notes, and we'll say that runtime is events to run during the game. And this is events to trigger at the start of the game. All right. And these are once. These are one-time events. Now, what makes this a one-time event is actually a condition that we're going to add into Gdevelop. So on startup, the events to trigger these are the events to trigger at the start of the game. These are the one-time events. So we need to click on the condition, And instead of going into our objects, this has nothing to do with our objects. Instead, this is an other condition. And if you don't know how to navigate here, you just go over to the other conditions. We're going to go to the scene, general scene, and we're going to look at the beginning of the scene. You can also just simply type and you'll see a bunch of things pop up. But if we scroll down, did I miss it? I guess we could just type beginning, huh? BEG at the beginning of the scene. So we'll just do BEG at the beginning of the scene. We'll click that and we'll hit OK. So you can simply just click and enter would be fine, but click and press OK. At the beginning of the scene is the beginning of our statement in our event sheet. So a statement is a condition. We're going to say a statement is a matter of fact. Okay. So as a matter of fact, the condition is at the beginning of the scene. This means built into Gdevelop, there's a event that is a visual sort of built-in application that says, run this one time at the beginning of the scene. Beginning of the scene only happens once in our game, right? That's when we start the game. Or whenever we press preview and it loads in. That's a loading of a scene. Now, these will become more complex as we add more game scenes or more layers into our game. But for now, this works perfectly great because this is our default game scene, the untitled scene. Now, what we want to do in Gdevelop, because everything is red from top down, we're going to just collapse this for a second and pretend like this doesn't exist. You can click on it, press D to disable it, D to re-enable it. So D for disable. And we can just, if we don't want programs to run, we can just click D, turn that off for now. So we see that strike through, meaning everything that's under this is now stricken, even though we have nothing there. So ignore this for now. At the beginning of the scene, we're going to click on it till it's highlighted. We're going to press Shift and D. And we can also just right click, add, and we can do a sub event, and which is different than a new event below. A new event below is like one of these. It's the same level of as like the default indentation. So as we move downwards, anything that's running here is connected. Anything that's underneath it in this way is now connected. So this will run only at the beginning of the scene. When we develop things in Gdevelop, the order of how we build structures are really important. And I want to get this into your education early on. This is probably one of the biggest hiccups that newbies make, and I want to sit down and digest this with you. So when we make a function call or a statement at the beginning of the scene, because it's such a profound statement, it must be at the top. So because this is so serious, it is only spoken once, and we never bring it in to our conversation again. So when we learn a programming language, usually I use my art programs to explain this sort of stuff in a visual way, but I'm going to do my best to, I'm going to end up having in the final edit a pop-up here, like a slideshow to introduce you like to the structure of how languages work. But just like a spoken language like English or German or anything like that, any spoken language, there are certain rules to conversations. So we have this in English. These are this is like the format of our grammar. So adjectives, nouns, verbs, those sort of things. Those are key points that are kind of consistent with all languages. That would be a language's the foundation of a language. Now, the way we assemble those into sentences is the next important step of not just understanding what these words are and what they mean. Like, I need to know how to say go to and bathroom so I don't have an accident in public, right? No matter what language you speak, that's probably something that you should know how to say. Now, those words are the key point in like the universal side of a language. So, you know, a loop is a loop. For the most part, a variable, like to every degree, a variable is a structure that can hold numbers or texts or and I said structure, which is actually a keyword that Gdevelop uses, which I didn't mean to imply. They are not structures, but we can add a structure, which is much like in other languages a dictionary. A structure is a verbal way of expressing a array of information that you might need to move around, and that's again, more advanced topics that I will dive into in the actual video series, because I want to express how each of these things work in a fundamental programming way, but we're going to kind of skip over some of that right now. So again, sorry, I'm going to come full circle here. Because of the way that Gdevelop conversates, there is something in all languages called syntax. Syntax in a programming language is more or less the grammatical structure, how we put together. When we say a sentence, do we say, that was good to eat? Or, good to eat that was, right? There's like, do you sound like Yoda when you speak? But there are languages, when compared to English, where you frame those languages in a different grammatical way, in a different structure, a different syntax. So that way you don't speak you don't put the emphasis on certain words at the same place you would with English. So that kind of might be hard to follow, but again, in English, in the proper way of expressing my words in a sentence, if I spoke them backwards, everyone would realize that doesn't sound right. And in some languages, the way you structure your speaking is you express it, like I said, in sort of a backwards to forwards way. At least that's the best way I can express how syntax works. And so it's very different between each language, but because of the foundation of Gdevelop, because it's a no script language, it doesn't require written code. It's a compositional language. The structure's really important, more so than maybe some other loose typed languages, non-TypeScript languages. Lua and Python have very loose structures in how you can word things, and there's numerous ways to do these, but anyways, I digress. Let's get back to the point. So in Gdevelop, because we read top down, anything that's included in here benefits from the topmost point. But if I was speaking, I would never need to say at the beginning of the scene, because that's a statement that's already been recorded as being true. So we don't need to repeat ourselves anything underneath here, which also means we don't need a condition called trigger once. Trigger once, while true, is an advanced setup tool, but this only happens once when the condition rings true. But a condition can be true multiple times. It can be turned on and off and re-enabled and disenabled, so it doesn't necessarily do the same thing as at the beginning of the scene. At the beginning of the scene is a one-time event, meaning that anything underneath it will only be run once, but it only happens at the start of the load. Now that we have that at the start of the load, we do not need to express ourselves again. So we don't need to say trigger once when this is true at the beginning of the scene. This will automatically, it'll do that. Now, there are some situations when you first load into a game where we might need to check settings and variables before we load in. We would do that above that and then check those settings after. Because again, from top down. So whatever is run up top above this would happen first, even if they're all happening at that 60 times a second, right? So that being said, at the beginning of the scene, we could adjust variables one time. So at the beginning of the scene, maybe we want to zoom in our camera. This is a great way to get introduced to camera zooms. Now you could, at the beginning of the scene, add the action here if you're not going to have an in-depth or more options at the beginning of the scene, but I want to explain it to you in a way that remains visual, and I think this is a better way of programming to keep your Gdevelop nice, neat, and clean. Okay? So even if it's only a one condition, drop it as a child and add it as an action. So here we go. At the beginning of the scene is a statement, a condition. So when this is true, we want to run our action. And we're not going to add it here because we have the child. We're going to add it here. Now, what do we want to do? We're going to go to Other, and we're going to go to Layers and Cameras, and we're going to set center the object, or center the camera on an object, and we can do that by just clicking on that. We're going to select the player dyno. We're on what layer are we zooming in on? Now, this is kind of important because some layers can get zoomed in while others don't, and this is kind of how a user interface will work. But because we have one layer, we can just say base layer, and the camera number on that is 0 default. We can actually add more cameras if we wanted to. It's very interesting. We can operate more than one camera on a layer, but in this particular case, we're going to zoom in the entire layer, on, which is camera 0. So let's go ahead and type 0 and hit OK. So now we're going to center the object on the player. We're going to hit OK, and the cameras at the very beginning of the scene centered him, or centered onto that character. We can kind of see that a little bit in the way that this was cut off compared to before. We can open this all the way. Now we can fully see. But that doesn't continue to happen. It only happens once. So there is a difference. So now if I was to copy this code, Control C, and we're going to click on this, press D, and open this back up. And now that we have all of this selected, we can Control V down here and it'll paste it. Or one of the other things you can do is if you just want to copy this, you click on it, Control C, and now when you highlight over the action, you can paste the action. So now we're going to run this code twice. But the difference is this at the beginning of the scene is running one time to center the object. And now because this runtime event, and we organized it in this way on purpose, because at the start, events to run during the game, and these are constantly running, right? So now that this is a constant run, just because that's what how we're going to organize it, we can see that without a condition, this is always true. So what we're saying is just always center the camera. There's no condition to be triggered here. There's no requirement to be met currently. We just say, hey, center that on the player. Hit preview. And now we can see that whenever I move, the camera is sticking with the player. Okay, that is pretty interesting. That's running with such minimal code. We're talking about one line of code. One line of visual script is now centering our object. Pretty neat. There's a lot of different ways that we can go about this, and because we're calling this every frame, and I want it to be constant, I'm just going to click on this and click delete. We don't need that to be running at the beginning of the scene as well. You could do it if you want it for organization purposes, or maybe it's specific to your game. Maybe the camera and the player don't start necessarily directly inside of the square. And again, this square that you see is only the viewport of the camera. This is what the camera sees. And that is the camera, the visualization of the camera. So that means as you move around and your character moves, this camera is going to continuously follow you. As I zoom out, this is the game world scene. This is all of the things that are in the scene, but Gdevelop only renders what's kind of immediately around the camera with a little bit of buffering room. Now, that is one kind of wild. That implies a lot in terms of like what you can build out here and how cameras work. But I want to dive into quickly the layering system of Gdevelop. Now that we have some basic movement and the camera following the player around, we want to create a new layer in our game called user interface, or UI. Let's say we want to add the player's life counter or something that moves around when the player moves. Now, this tends to be an issue with new people. They don't understand exactly how the camera system works or how to manipulate those cameras in a way that makes it so that everything moves the way it should or the way you expect it to. So inside of Gdevelop, in the layers category, if you have closed it, it's just this little sandwich thing up here, the three paper layers. We can go add a new layer, and we're going to highlight this one and call it UI, or user interface. And if we click on this little button, anything we now add from the scene objects into here will be on the UI layer. Now, I want to show you how this works with another player object. So now if we click on this object, we have one on the base layer and one on the UI layer. Now, because they're two different instances, they both can exist at the same time with different settings. And so what'll happen is that the screen will follow this dyno, even if this dyno, like we'll move them over here. We'll press preview, and the controls, as we can see, are, there's something off here. As we saw, that dyno just yeeted himself into oblivion. What's happening is that this character, even though it's being registered on on this layer, like it's still registering all the objects on different layers. What's happening is because of the zoom and the way that it's targeting this player, this dinosaur is not being placed where we would expect it, because this default layer is the camera, and now when we move the camera, that black square here follows this character on that layer. This character is on a different layer, and that means that because of that, and the camera isn't following it, it will stay in this camera boundary, if that makes sense. I mean, I'm trying to visually give you kind of a better example here. What'll happen, and as we saw here, is the character was able to stand off of the edge. Well, it's technically on the edge of the base layer because of the position of where it exists in 3D space, or in the 2D space with the camera. In like, yeah, I'm gonna have to just give me a second here. We're gonna go over into a new tile. Let me explain this a little bit of a better way. So if the camera of the base layer exists like this, so this is the base layer, the UI layer exists over top of it in the same way. However, when the base layer is moving like this, the UI layer doesn't move. So technically, whatever exists on the UI layer will be moving. So let's say, as we see here, the base layer has the platforms. When that sprite on the UI layer is standing here, even if this moves, it registers the hitboxes and other things as existing here until it slides off. So it'll kind of slide this way, and that's where that character is kind of free floating in space, and then eventually it'll fall because we moved the collision out from underneath it because it's bound to that layer. So that camera moves everything that's in it on its own. Now, at the same time, which is interesting, is because that camera is following the player in that layer, the player can move like this, and the camera will move with it, but technically speaking, those are still here. Because the camera is moving, not the layout, right? So eventually, because the player is bound to this as we're moving the player, because that layer is still technically there, it'll fall off, but it'll fall off on this layer, and we'll be able to see it even if the camera on this, because this one's in the background, we'll be able to see that player just fall straight down. It'll never leave the canvas and move around in the environment like the base player does. Okay, that's a lot of information. Let's see that in a more real-time thing. I'm going to show you that using a different object. We're going to add our first text object. And I'm going to explain this as, we're going to say UI debug. So this is our debugger text. We're going to put, I am the debugger. And we're going to add that into our layer. Now, I added it automatically to the UI layer. I'm actually going to change this layer to base layer so I can show you this in real time. So now when we log in into our game, we're going to preview it again. We see that I am a debugger is at the top left of our screen, but when we move our character, it moves the game scene, right? Because the camera of that game scene is following the player. So even though the canvas doesn't technically move, it binds it to that position, even though the camera is moving away. The viewport is moving, but the base game scene isn't. Now, if I switch this over to the UI layer, which is the camera has no logic, so it never moves, right? We never added follow on that layer to follow the player. So because, see here, we have center the camera, and we double click on this camera 0 of the base layer. That means the default camera of the layer, the viewport will always be following this player. But because the UI layer has no camera conditions, when we move, we can see that that never changes. It never slides away because the camera is permanent. So UI layers naming it UI doesn't make it a UI layer. The way we treat it and handle it in the game engine is what is going to make it a UI layer. So instead, here, we can change I'm a debugger to something a little bit more important. Let's say we want to keep track of our player value. So now what we're going to do is dive into variables. variables. Variables are now a more accessible feature inside of Gdevelop, and they express themselves in a way that I find a little bit easier to explain to new beginners. As you can see here on the dyno, we have an instance variable, but if we double click on the dinosaur and we go into variables, this is the parent object of that main base variable, right? So every time we create this, whatever our defaults are here are going to be applied to that instance's variable. So let's talk about this. When do we use an object variable versus when do we use a global or a scene variable? I'm going to show you at least where to find all of those, and then we'll talk about those differences. Well, first of all, an object variable is bound to each individual object that exists. So if I had two dinosaurs like we had before, and one of them is on animation 1, which is crouch, and this one's on animation 2. So we're just going to preview. And when we move, they both move together, right? However, one of them is being tracked by the camera, which is the first instance that we created because it's the number 1, it's the priority. And then this one is kind of an afterthought in that way, but it won't follow that one. It won't get confused between which one because this one came after this one. This is the main object, but each of them have their own status. So again, adding an object variable, let's say health, for example. Let's go into the dyno, go to variables. We're going to add a variable. Now, this variable we can title it anything, and we're going to title it health for now. And we're going to change it to, well, it's a number. We can change it to a text object, or in this case, we might also call them strings. You'll hear me call them strings a lot, or text string, but a string is just a text that's wrapped in quotes, like speaking. So this is anything that would be like written, formatting, anything like that. It's non-number related. It's not a Boolean. A Boolean is a true and false trigger. We have arrays and we have structures, but we're not going to get in that right now. So we're going to go to number and we're going to say 3. We have 3 life. Excuse me for the hiccup. Let me just double check that sound coming through my phone. Make sure that we're all on the same page. Let me see here. All right. So health, sorry, let me get back into here. Health number is equal to 0. And this is inside of the object. So if we go in here now, we now see that we have an instance variable. I can change this one to 1, and this instance will remain at 3 because that's the default setting. Each instance can have its own settings. This is really important as we get into enemies and enemy logic later on. Not in this video, but later on. I'll be explaining how to use object instances and control them, multiple of them at one time. But for now, we're going to get rid of the dyno. That is not important. And we're going to re-establish this dinosaur. We're going to change him back to 0, and I'm going to put his health back to 3. Okay, so this character is our main character. It's the one that we need to be focusing on. Now, this object dyno, now has a behavior, or a variable called health. That is only accessible if this object exists in the current game scene. So it must exist for us to be able to access it in the triggers. If it isn't added to the game scene, it will, and then we try to like do logic based on it existing, like changing this object's movement speed. This object must exist on the game scene first before we can change its settings. That also means if we go into the untitled scene, right, we can change those settings here because he exists now. But if he didn't exist, we'd have to create it first, like at the beginning of the scene, create the player, and then change its settings. And that's why, again, top-down matters. What you say, how you express it is very important in Gdevelop. So that would have to go above everything else. So at the beginning of the scene, create the player, right? So we could then, at the beginning of the scene, we could create the dyno, create the object. So objects, create an object. Sorry, I did that weirdly. If you click on an object, a dino, the dino will then create the object. But if it doesn't exist, you can't create it, right? So instead of doing it this way, we need to go into other actions, objects, create an object. We're going to create a dino at the position of, let's just say 500 by 500. Okay. So when we do that, we're going to see we have a new dino and it exists. So we created that dino at 500, 500. Now that that dino exists, and if we come in here and delete this character, it'll be created from the base object. So we know it has 3 life. We'll click on it, and there we can see now it's following the character because it was created, and now we can access it. So now you have 2 ways of creating your character. When you're designing your prototype or anything like that, I don't recommend you do it this way unless it's called for some reason. But I would stick with creating your object first, just to make it easier for you. But now that we have that character present, right? So now that we have the character present, if we changed, I'm going to actually show you one more thing. So if we change this to a trigger once while true with no condition, that's kind of like saying whenever you read this, trigger this one time, but only trigger it once because there's no other conditions. Create this character. So we're going to check this out again. Well, the character is being created, right? It's being created on the base layer. And then we're going to run the camera on it, but we already have a character. So let's get rid of him. Let's see this one more time. It only created the character once. Okay, interesting. As it should, right? Because we just triggered this once, but it's kind of not the same thing as saying this, because this means whenever this reads, only do it once. This is saying when the scene starts. But now that we've created this character, what I'm going to do is at the beginning of the scene, we're going to add an action. And for demonstration purposes, I'm not going to drop it down. Normally I would add it right here, but we're going to add it right to this section. And we're going to say debug UI text. So we're going to select the text we have on the screen. We're going to click on the text variable, which allows us to change what is inside of the character, or like what is inside of that. Right now it says I am a debugger, and now we can change the actual text variable. And you can see here, it requires you to write quotes. And now I can say, this is working, right? So this is working. So now at the beginning of the game scene, even though it says I'm a debugger, when we run it, it should say this is working. Okay, this is working. That works. Perfect. Now I'm going to show you kind of what happens when you don't create them in the right order. So here's a trigger once. This is going to run, but this runs first. So if the player object doesn't exist and we go into our UI layer, like now we're going to include something from the dinosaur into this object. So we can pass variable information along into Gdevelop in so many different ways. These are called expressions. So if I clicked on this text, we're going to double click on this to open this up. So here we can see this little E and ABC. This is an expression menu. Now, this is pretty intense because there's a lot going on here, but I want to explain this as even though an object may be a text variable object or it has some sort of string related thing, we can add in programming logic into this section. And that's what this expression thing is for. So if you wrap it in quotes, this is what's going to visually be printed in that text, but we can pass information that already exists from something else. So what we're going to do is delete that. And instead, we're going to go to our expressions. We're going to go to objects, and then we're going to click on objects again. And we can kind of see that there's, and I'm just going to kind of click on a couple of things just so you can see what's going on here. Now, none of this is what we're going to be using, but I wanted to show you that there are things that we can check for in real time. Okay. Now, what it doesn't really show you, even if you scroll all the way down, we can go to movement, configuration and stuff, but that's not what we were looking for, right? There's more that you can do here, things that it doesn't show you. And this comes with time. But I want to show you how you can target an object. This is the syntax, the way that you need to say this in Gdevelop to make this happen. Okay? So this is what you're going to do. You're going to start typing the name of the object that we want to target. So we know all of our objects start with obj. Object, right? We started it this way. Object player, no, object dino. Because the dinosaur is holding the variable information. The object has a variable. We gave it the variable of life, which is a number. So if we select this by pressing enter, you can now see immediately after. So once you write the object's name and you click on it, so now we duplicated that, we don't want that, but once you start typing what it is, object dino, and now we're going to do it all the way so that you can kind of see what it looks like when you handwrite it. We're going to write dino, and now if we want to access things from the dino, we do one simple thing after we say its name: add a period. The period then says we're targeting something inside of the object. So object's title, the name of the object, dot whatever it is that you're trying to target. We can do the animation, an effect, the flippable, the opacity of it. We're changing a text value though, because remember, we're editing the text object, the UI debugger, its text value. We want to print something in here, and what we're saying is whatever this number is, print it. So what I'm going to show you is, now we can see right here, it is you see that cube? That's the image for an object. So object instance variable is the health, which is, we see 1, 2, 3. That means it's a number. It's a number variable. If it's a text or string, or like had ABC in there, then you would know that that's a string thing. So now we just say object underscore dino dot health. Okay, no quotes or anything like that. We're just going to pass that through. Set it to this. We're going to preview it. Look what happens. 0. Huh. Interesting. Because dino health should be 3, right? Well, what's happening, this call is right. But what's happening is the dinosaur doesn't exist until after the text is created. Now watch this. If I drag this down 1, okay, and then we move our creation of our character first. Now that we can do it in here too, it doesn't matter, right? We can do it like this, and we can also do it like this, or like this, as long as it happens after. So we could toggle it like this. So after you create the character, check down, then do this. Well, we're going to do it at the same time. So here we go. Now we can see it's 3. Why? This object exists now. If I get rid of the dino and we preview, it's the same thing as not having one. So 0 is going to report 0, null, void. 0 is null and void. And so now if we add the character object back into the game, press preview, it'll work, because the character exists at the beginning of the scene before anything else happens. So that order really matters. But we'll also see that when I added the player, it looks funny because I added the player to the UI layer. And that happened automatically because of this button down here. If you want to go back to using the base layer, that's how you do it. So now we have the base of our game where we have our life total being present, and we have our character that we can move around. It doesn't have any complex logic, but that's the beginning of that. So now we can target that in real time. Now there's other types of variables too. There's scene variables. So if you right click on this and go to scene properties, we can open this up. We've seen this before. It's also this symbol up here. We can open this up and click something called scene variables. Now scene variables, it looks just like the player variable thing. You click add this, and it looks exactly the same as object variables, because variables work the same way. It's just how you can access them. A scene variable is a variable that is only accessible. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to only accessible in this event sheet, in this event viewport, in that way. So whenever you add a scene variable, it's tied into the layout in which you're using it. So if this game is going to have, let's say, a timer for the map, you could do it here in the scene variable if it only is bound to this section. There's lots of other use cases for this, but the reality is scene objects are bound to what you specifically need that isn't an object related thing. You could make a variable in the game scene that's players' lives or something like that and run it through the game scene. But once the player leaves the game scene and goes somewhere else, if that's the way you program it, then you will lose access to all of those variables that you've been holding on to. So we don't want to do that. Instead, if there's a variable that we want to hold on to throughout the progression of the game or throughout numerous other game scenes and transitions, we would want to then create it as a global variable. This is a globally accessible thing that no matter where we access it in the events, it's usable everywhere. All right. So again, we can add that variable, and now we can add different things. Now, here's something that's interesting. I want to introduce you to a advanced feature right now in Gdevelop. Now, all objects and all variables, whether it's a global variable, it's a scene variable, it's a object variable, or a local variable, right? All of these have a object type, a variable type, called structure. Now, a structure is very interesting, and it differs from an array. Now, I'm going to visually explain these in my art program because I think it'll come across easier that way. Hey, Sean, thanks for jumping in and checking out what's going on. I'm teaching some Gdevelop now, so tune in and hopefully you learn something. But and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm here for it. But jumping back into it, a structure. Again, a structure, no matter where it is it holds information in. Let's call this one. We're gonna call this one game data. Okay, game data structure. We're gonna add another one, and we're gonna call this one. Player data, and we're gonna create another one, and we're gonna call this one key bindings. Okay. Or we can just call this input, actually. Input. All right. And we're going to change this to a structure as well. So now, similarly to how we accessed the the object information with the dot, right? Game data, or in the other one, it was object dino dot, the health, right? Game data is now a storage for additional information. So we click the add child, and now we can add a new variable underneath game data. So we're going to call this one, let's say this is music, right? A music volume, right? And we're going to set this one to, let's say 50%, 50 volume out of 100. Now, if we wanted to access that value, now I'll hit apply. We'll go into our script where we change the UI. We're going to move this one back up. And now we're going to, instead of setting it to the dino.health, now we can set it to a global variable. And we're going to set this to game. And here we go. Game data. Game data. Game data dot what object or what variables do we want to target? Well, we've only declared one. Declaring means we added it to the browser. We added it to the system to be able to visually see it like this. And Gdevelop does require you to declare now everything. So game data dot music volume. Okay. Game data dot music volume is a global variable that is, as we saw, a number variable. Even though it's string, we don't need to pass through. You may see other conditions and other tutorials that teach you how to do this a little bit differently. And you may see variable, hold on. They've changed some things on me. Variable to string. Huh. Variable, let's see, to string. Okay, you'll still see it here. So to number, to string. So sorry, they changed a couple of things, so that was a little embarrassing. But to string, to angle or degree, to number, you don't need to pass this through like this. This is a conversion. You're converting it from one thing to another. But because it's just reporting, you're saying set the text equal to. Now this would be almost like saying go backwards to what we just were at game data, right? Game data dot, what is it? Dot volume, press down, enter, adds it all for you. So game data dot music volume is already returning green. There's no error here, which means that it's reporting the number correctly. The number is 50, right? So even though we're only doing this once, setting it to 50, that's letting us know what its current volume is. Now, if I clicked on this, right, and I wrote 50, you'll see that it requires me to write it in quotes. So quotes. 50. But this is now me saying 50 and not, and which is the same thing as what we just did. So I'll show you that. So one of the things that you can do in strings, which is a very important part of using Gdevelop, is linking things together. You can use that with just the plus sign. So 50 plus, and now we're going to do something different. Now I could say 50 plus 1, but these are strings. So it's only going to report 501. It's going to look like 501. Watch. Well, you first have to close it. So 501, because this is reporting it like you're writing it out in a text message. You're like, hey mom, I got that soda you wanted for $2, right? That's ridiculous. But hey mom, I got that soda you wanted for $2. That's what you're saying. You're speaking it. That's what the quote is for. Now, when you target a variable, you can do so by just calling the object or variable title. So everything, because it is a compositional language in Gdevelop, you can call it via just its title. So again, the title is game data. Now this is interesting because this is a number, right? You would think that we need to do toString, so toString, and then wrap this inside of that. And now you're saying, well, it's reporting green now. It's toString, game data, music volume. And you'll see that it actually does do the same thing, but you don't need to call it this way. You're converting a number. This global in this case is now thinking it is a text string. You've changed it from being a number variable to a text string, and that can mess all sorts of things up. So the best thing for you to do is, let's say we're going to type two different things now. Music volume, okay? Now we're going to go colon, space, and then we're going to add the end quote. Because a space inside of quotes is a character. So you know when you press the space bar inside of like Notepad and it adds a indentation, a space, it's actually the same as if you press the A key, except for it translates it as a blank key. There's just nothing there. So space key is actually a key that has no value. So if I add a space here, I can add 15 of them. It wouldn't change the way that Gdevelop reads the program. It's looking for whatever is after this. Immediately look for the next thing. And a plus sign inside of here is not the same thing as a plus sign outside of it. Because again, anything that's inside of quotes gets turned into text. So now that we added that space, now we can go space again, because now we're adding something to it. And now we're going to go game data dot music, or in this case, game data dot music volume. And now you'll see it's a valid code. When I run this, you'll see now that music volume has a space and it says 50. Now, at the beginning of the scene, we're going to do that. Now, trigger one time, we're going to now target. Now, I'm going to show you how to do some variable calls. Now, we're going to target the action. We have to type variable, change a variable value. And we see general variables, and then we also have an object variable. You got to pay attention to what's underneath it. So we're going to click on change a variable, and now we can literally target whatever structure we want, whatever variable we want, whatever key we want. We're going to say, hey, we've already declared game volume, and I'm going to subtract, and we're going to subtract 5 from it. So at the beginning of the scene, we're going to write the variable, and then we're going to one time remove 5 from the game data variable. Okay, preview. Well, wait, hold on, Alex. That says 50. It should say 45, right? We minus 5 from it. Why doesn't it say that? Because, look, again, at the beginning of the scene, this happens once, only once. When that runs, it disables itself. It'll never check it again unless we reload. And that doesn't work the way that, the way that we're talking about. So although in the engine, and I want to show you this, there's a really cool feature that we can do. If you click on the drop-down area, okay. If we click on the drop-down arrow, we can now click on the preview and debugger. If we click on the debugger, it launches our game, and then we have this thing in the background. We click on here and click refresh. It's the 30-second preview that we've done since we've started our session today. So that's what that is. If you have more than one running, you can actually jump between them by clicking on this. But anyways, hey, Henry, thank you so much. I appreciate you enjoying the tutorials. We're going through some big changes that have recently happened in Gdevelop. I would recommend you watch all of this later if you can, but I will be chopping all of this up into really small videos that are easy to digest. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you so much, like you said. And hopefully this will be super helpful for you, bud. I really appreciate it. So here we can see, though, I wanted to show you that if we go to our scene variables, there's nothing here, right? But if we go to global variables, now we can see the variables that we've already created in our game. Now we see that music volume is set to 45. Now we did change this volume, right? We're going to go back into our here. We did change it, but it didn't report it because it's not constantly being told to do it. So again, even if we trigger this once, now we want this text to always do this. We really don't, but I'm going to show you it that way. So now we're going to copy this, and we're going to click on this and disable it with D again, disable it. And then we're going to go down here and we're going to paste it. So because we already copied it, we can just highlight, remember, and do paste actions. So now we're going to, now it doesn't really matter what order this is in, but these are constantly running. Now we're going to press preview. And now we see it's at 45. Now anytime that this changes now in real time, so let's go ahead and add a new event. We're going to, when the key, we're going to type key as in keyboard, key is pressed, and we're going to do released, actually. So when the key of, let's say, A or S, let's do S for subtract. When the S key is released, we're going to immediately do something. We're going to copy the variable, and we're going to paste it down here. So now we're going to disable this one too. And now anytime we press the S key, we're going to -5. And it's going to read in real time. And we see it reporting in real time. But the question that you need to ask yourself as a developer, and as you get more experience in Gdevelop, you'll figure this out. Is this the right way to have this report? Because again, in Gdevelop, it reads top down all of the scripts once every frame. And now that's once every frame that it renders, and so that can be very quick. We're running this 60 times a frame, so it's 60 times a second, right? It's running 60 times, 60 times a second. Okay, that is an incredible amount of time to keep running the same script. So what do we do instead? How can we minimize the impact and program in a way that doesn't leave these open-ended resource hogs? Because it will, over time, slow down your game. Now, it might not happen in the very beginning, and that's normal because you don't have a whole lot going on in your game. But as you add more and more and more, you have to start considering when and how we do these things. So now that we have this base thing set up, I'm going to re-enable at the start of the scene. We're going to set it once, and then we're going to disable that event. And then what we're going to do is, when we press the S key, we're going to move the text from here. We're going to drag it out and just put it underneath here. So now, whenever the S key is released, at the beginning of the scene, we're going to set up the text. And then whenever the S key is released, we're going to subtract 5 and then update it. Now watch this. S key is held down, S key is released, but it only triggered that during one of those frames one time while I released it. That's big because now it's not running every single second. We don't need it to update every single second. We need it to update whenever we tell it to do something. We want to update it when we give a user input key, and then it only happens that one time. Now that's important because now it's not going to indefinitely run and take down our resources and prevent us from building a more in-depth game. So global variables are things that are going to continue no matter how many game scenes I have. So although we have S key, this is one scene. If I was to create a new game scene, we're going to go to scenes, add another one. This one can be tutorial extra. So tut extra. Doesn't matter what you call it. Double click it after you rename it because it will close. And now we have the untitled scene and the tutorial extra. Now in the tutorial extra events, as you can see, I have no objects. So if I go into here and I create a new event and I'm checking, there's no player. The player's gone because it's tied to the specific event group, or it's to the specific scene, right? So then if we go into our other conditions and our objects, there's nothing there. There's literally nothing to pull from. We can't even target the UI text because it doesn't exist. So now we have to go in here and have to create a new object if we want that. Now, for things that are continuously used, there's a little secret that you can do in Gdevelop. And now that's going to be, we're going to take that UI and we're going to move it from a scene object into a global variable. Now you can't undo this, but you should use this sparingly. Please don't just do it immediately, right? You should know what you're doing in that, And so when we add this, it now converts it to a global variable. Now this text can be targeted anywhere. So we open this one up and there it is. Okay, cool. We can bring this back in. We need to create a new user interface layer, right? Because there is no, we need a user interface for our UI, but there's no objects on here. There's no programming. So effectively it's a blank scene again. There's nothing going on. And so if I pressed preview from here, it would just load this section, not the previous part of our game. Okay. So now that we targeted the UI and we see that it's the same as the other one, we change it inside of the text, right? So we can go back into our text event, now target the user interface debugger and the text debugger, and then target its text variable and type game data.music volume. Okay, so if I was to hit OK here and then preview it, we would now see nothing happens because Alex is ridiculous and I put that in the wrong spot. So this is a condition. So if the text equals the music volume, do something. That was silly of me. We don't need to do that. Instead, what we want to do is go to actions, click on this, click on the text, and then set this to something. Not is it equal to this? Now we're saying, no, set it to this. So now we're going to go in here and say game data dot music volume and hit OK. So now when we press preview, we'll see it's 50, right? Because this is a global variable. Now this is kind of interesting because here we're going to actually duplicate the, we're going to go to runtime events, Shift D to create a new little variable or a new, event. And then we're going to check a key release. So we're going to copy this one and paste it here. And we're going to change it from S to W. So when W key is pressed, we're going to go to the actions, type scene, and we're going to change the scene. We're going to change the scene. And the scene is going to go to tutorial extra. And we're going to stop or delete the game scene that we're currently on when we do that. So we're going to say stop any other pause scenes. Yes, when we load another scene, it pauses the scene that we're currently on, or not, or stops them, which is closing them down. So we're going to say, okay. So when we press the S key, we should be minusing 5. And then when we press the W key, we should be loading in to this event. And we're going to be looking for any changes that happened to the music volume. So watch this. So we're going to start here. We're going to I pressed the wrong key. We're going to press S to minus, and then press W. And now we moved over, and we can see that the new scene loaded, and the variable stayed the same. Why? It's a global variable. That's why. Now, again, because there are no variables inside of, we can't target the player because he's a single solo object inside of this one. So to go back, if we wanted to target the player's health, and we wanted to continue what we did before, let's say health, and then we'll do that, plus, and then object underscore, there is none. We can't do Dino. Dino doesn't exist here. we'll see that it errors out. Dino, and we'll do it again, dino.health, just so you know, dino.health, that object doesn't exist. It can't possibly pull information that doesn't exist because each scene is independent, right? Because again, the object can only exist in a global format if we make it a global, and or the variables are only accessible in that way. So even if I go into a game scene and we right click here, go to properties, go to scene variables, we're going to add a new one. We're going to call this, let's say we'll say player.health, okay? Or not .health, sorry, just player health, one word. And we're going to say it's 3. Different than lives, player health. Now, we made it a scene variable. If we go to this scene, right click, go to scene properties, it doesn't exist. Because it's just like object variables, but they're just accessed through a different sort of menu, right? But they work the same way. When you leave this area, it no longer exists, so therefore it can't pull any data, even if it exists prior. Does that make sense? So even if this existed prior and then we changed the game scene, you still, even if it's paused, you can't pass information back and forth without it being a global variable or a global object. So in my opinion, what I would recommend anyone who's doing this, objects should be in charge of themselves. Every object you use in your game should be in charge of itself, except for possibly the player. So for every enemy, the object's variables should be housed inside of that object. So if the enemy has a life value, it should be inside of that object. If it, and so on and so forth. You don't want to add that stuff to global variables, unless maybe it's a player. So going back here, we have player data. Now, player data, right, as a structure, we can add player data.health, right? And we're going to say that the health of this character is 100. Now, we can send information from a global variable to an object and vice versa. We could set the health of the global variable equal to an object that currently exists, but we have to do that inside of the event. So in this particular case, okay, what we can say is we can change the variable of life. Let's say when we transition on release, before we change where we're going to set the variable. So again, var for variable. It's not an object variable. It's a global variable. We're going to target the player data player, or in this case, that's a scene variable, player health. We can go edit variables. We see here we have a scene variable of player health. We're going to delete that, and we're going to delete this one in here, and we're just going to use the health, right? So we just have health. Actually, we have player data. We're gonna, did I not save that as an expression? Let's go back and check that real quick. Variable player data. Oh, I didn't. Health is not where I thought I put it. We'll put it there. There we go. So player data dot health. It only can be a dot if it's underneath it as a structure. And I'll get back into structures and arrays. I know I digressed, but we'll go there in a minute. So when we go in here, and now when we change the scene, when we go to move out of it before we transition, we want to save data into the global variable. So we're going to go to value, again, variable value, change it. Now we're going to target player data, again, player data dot health. If I just do player data, it's going to want to create a local, like it's going to try to create use player data as something. It's undefined. We can set it as something, but we don't want to do that. We want to use health. And then now we can save this as the object dino.health. Okay. So right before we leave, we're going to change the global variable to the dino health. And then inside of here, we're going to go back into here and we're going to pull out the health as the global variable. Oops, the variable of, and now in Gdevelop, you don't have to write global. You literally can just write what it is. So it's player data dot health. All right. That's a global variable. Now, if we were loading into this game scene and we wanted it to be polished and nice. We're going to say at the beginning, right? At the beginning of the game scene, we want to target our player, which we don't have one yet. So I'm gonna create a new one. We're gonna call this one object player this time, and we're gonna reference backwards to I don't know why I capitalize all that. I usually don't. We're gonna go backwards here and use the method that we did before. So we're just gonna do a 16 by 16, resize that. I technically don't need to well, shoot. Okay, we're just going to create this as a blue object, just like we did before. We can leave it as new sprite for now. And then we're going to add this sprite to the game. And we're going to go into variables, and we're going to create a new variable called health. And we're going to look at its number, and its number is just going to be 0. We don't need to, you can't declare something that doesn't already exist. And you can't pull it from thin air. We can't set this right now to the global variable. We can't I can't write global variable, or I can't write player data.health. That doesn't work. So we have to then go into our scene. At the beginning of the scene, we want to change the player object, and now we want to once we click on the player object, we want to target their variable. So now we're going to say player object and then variable value. Another way to do this, if you didn't click on the player in action, is to write variable. And here we can see general variable, general objects variable. We would click on this one. It's the same thing. And we can just declare it in a different visual way, but I like clicking on this. And we're going to go to change variable down here in variables. If you follow this format instead, I always just type var variable. And now we can target the object. We don't have to call it by name, because the object's health... Oh, 1 second, guys. I got to take this. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I appreciate the patience here. Okay, so back to what we were saying with actions. So now we can go to the player object, change the variable value of health, and we can now change it to that global variable, which is player data dot health. And the reason why we can do that is because it's pre-declared here. So now, at the beginning of the scene, change the health of that player object equal to the player.health, or the player data.health. So now we're synchronizing the object's variable with that global variable. So then that means if we, at the beginning of the scene, if we created a player for this game scene, which we will now do, is go to here, other actions, objects, create an object, create the player at, and we're going to use another text expression called screen width, and we're going to do that divided by 2. And we're going to say on the Y position, screen height divided by 2. This means perfectly in the center of the game screen. And now we're going to create that. And we can see that there is an object there. And now we already have one because we created it here. So we're going to delete that. And now we can see that it's right there. Okay. Now this is interesting. So let me show you how this works. Because the global variable is constantly going, that's one of those variables that is like is being able to be read at any point in time. When we transfer game scenes now, because of these mechanics that we've built, we're going to press preview here. We're going to press S to reduce our volume, which doesn't do anything, right? And then we're going to press W, and we're going to see that we only have 3 life. Life 3, health 3. Because that's, even though we set the object, now we're going to go back in here, and when we add the player object, right, we can see that health is 0. So that means that the input that we have here is 0. It's null and void. That doesn't matter. And when we create it, it inherits from the parent object, so it'll be 0. But then it does transfer between the health variable of the global object variable of health into the player. And again, now we can actually go into the, oh yeah, sorry, this is the health of the player, to player data.health. Now we can validate that this is working, that when we change the game scene, what I want to do is now we're going to change a variable. So we're going to paste this here. We're going to move it up. So all I do is copy that just so I can change the text here. And we're going to change that to player data health, and we're going to subtract 1. Every time we change the game scene in our game, we're going to deal 1 point of damage to our character. And then we're going to update that. So then whenever the health is subtracted, at the same time, we're going to then change the health variable to the dino. But that doesn't make sense, right? Because now what happens is the dino's health is going to overwrite whatever we set the health to. Because right now it's 3, I believe, right? Let's go back to our global variables. Player data health is actually 100. So the dino health in this game is 3. See, he's got 3 here. So that means that was successfully working, right? It changed it to 3 when we loaded into the world because the dino's health was written over to the player data health, which is 100. And then if we subtracted 1, at the current value, that would have been 99, and then we're setting it back to 3. And if we did it this way, this would be effectively the same thing as hurting the dinosaur after we report its health change. But that systematically also doesn't make sense. So what we want to do instead of targeting the variable of the player data health, we can actually go backwards, and we would have to change the variable call to be the object first. So again, it would be object underscore dino. But because we're using the other actions, this immediately thinks that it's going to be a global or a scene variable. Instead, we got to go back to objects, dino, and then do variable. Change the variable. And now we're going to change the variable of it to health. And we're going to subtract 1. And then we're going to report the dino's health. So this is the proper format that you would want to use. You could do it the other way technically, but it's a little messy. So let's damage the dinosaur, because the dinosaur is in charge of its own life. And then we're going to -1 to it. And then we're going to change the total health value from 100 down to the current dino's life, which should be 2. And then we're going to change the scene. Let's check that out. So we have our music volume, which changes on this page. That's good. And now we're going to press W to warp to our next area. And now we see that we have 2 life. And this object does nothing because it has no logic. Going back over here, we have no logic. We're going to change the behavior of this player cube, and we're going to change it to a 4-way movement. Whoa, we're breaking the rules, guys. We're doing something that has never been done before. No, I'm just kidding. We are going to change our game from platformer to top-down in seconds. Check this out. Watch this. So now we still have default controls. We're going to allow diagonals, which is, so 4-directional is top, down, left, and right. But then 8-directional is with the 4 directions, up, down, left, and right, plus the diagonal top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. Okay? We're going to turn, we're going to leave, actually allow diagonals on, but we're going to turn off rotate the object. You don't want your object to spin as it's turning. Maybe if you're playing true top down, like a bird's eye view perspective directly down on the player, you'd want to do a rotate object, or maybe a space game, like a ship or an asteroid game, something like that. You would use rotate object for that. However, now when we go to play this, we now have up, down, left, and right movement, including the diagonals, based on our keyboard input. And now we see that our health is set to 100. So this is interesting. So now we have a way of changing our game scene on the push of a button. But imagine if you change this condition to something else. Let's say every time we transition our game between the top-down, or the side-scroller format and the top-down format, you take 1 point of health damage. So maybe in our game, there's some sort of element that prevents us from doing some of that. Now, what I want to do is go over to our tutorial extra, and I want to go into our player object. And now what I would like to do is add in the previous sprites that I'm missing. And so we can go back into our, and type dino, right, dinosaur. We have our blue dinosaur guy. It's probably easier if we go to here, choose from the asset store. Nope, wrong, Alex. That's, well, this will have to work. Okay, so I can click on, you see it's like underscore idle underscore 4, 3, 2, 1. Technically, you need to start here, and you can add them one at a time, which takes a disgusting amount of time. So what we're going to do is change the way that our game mechanically plays a little bit. To do that, we're going to close this player object down. And, okay, hello. We have the player object, and we could create a new one. Say we wanted to completely change the art and the characters change format. Maybe there's 2 characters that can be played. Like one character is like a 2D and one's a 3D, or maybe it's kind of like Paper Mario, or not, maybe not Paper Mario, but Paper Mario, yeah. Where you like change directions and whatnot. There's a lot of whatever you can think of, man. You could do it here, right? So, but I want to use the same sprite and the same character, and there's 2 ways of doing that. One, we can create the player object again and do what we had just done with synchronizing their variables, or we can turn the previous character into a global object, so we can access them on a different game scene. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to doing it either way, and I'll show you both of those. So if we go into our new game scene and we create a new object and we click on game asset store, and we're going to go back to our dino because we want all of that character's animations. So now we're going to press add and add again to make sure it not add again, my bad. We already added it once. Now we have the dino character, and we're going to rename it just for naming convention's sake. Object underscore dino. Come on, there we go. So now that we have the object dino, it's not the same as this one, even though they're named the same. We're going to get rid of player because we don't need that anymore. This one is just an animation. There's nothing going on here. We're going to re-add the top-down behavior, and we're going to leave diagonals on, turn off rotate. And now at the beginning of the game scene, instead of creating the player, we're going to create the dino. we just press into that. And now the dino, object dino, needs a health variable. And it's red because it hasn't been declared. So we go back into here, go to our variables, and we're going to add health. And we can see that we're using it even though it's not declared. So you can still use them, but you need to declare them if you want them in the dropdown. And we're going to set this behavior to 0 because we're going to, just like before, we're going to pass that back through. Now, so effectively, what we've done is mimicked this item texturally to be the same as this item. But the difference is this one is side scroller and this one is top down. So when I press preview here and I move my character around, or in this case, both of them, I guess, because I put one on the game scene. Let's delete him. There we go. Whatever. And now we can see that we have top-down movement. And if it was a side scroller, we would then fall due to gravity. So we can see that those two clearly different behavior types are now being accessible via two different objects. Now, we can do it that way, and that's the way that for beginners I would recommend you do it. However, there is a more advanced way to do it, and I want to show you that now. So what we're going to do is briefly rename this to object dino underscore top down, TD, top down. Okay? So now we have the dino top down, and the reason why I renamed that is because we're going to create the same object as a global object. So we're going to take the other object that we had from our first scene. We're going to drag it into a global. Remember, this cannot be undone. So watch me do this. Don't do this yourself. Watch me do this. When I hit OK, object dino now is going to be accessible in the global objects. So one advantage of creating a global object is never needing to pass through the health data in this way. In fact, we can just sort of delete that. And now when we subtract one health, we can go back into our area over here and change this for object dino. And we'll set this not to player health, but to the, we don't need to actually change that variable at all. What we'll do is change the health equal to the object dino dot health. So he's at 0 life, top down character, because it's still creating the top-down character. So what we want to do is change this creation now to be object dino, hit preview again, and now it falls because it's creating the right object. It is creating now the global object of that player. Now, its life, if we start, it starts at 3, right? So if we preview this, it's 3. But if I go to this game scene, preview it from here, and I press W, well, it didn't pass over. So, and that's because it's, hello? I might have just went off on an unnecessary tangent. That changed? Why is that? Why did that not change? Oh, because we're creating a new one. That is why. So so we'd still need to save the variable. Yeah, so this is what objects, interesting. So you still have to declare and save the global variable between the object, because when the scene ends, it deletes the object. So we would just need a single variable to restore the player's health to keep it synchronized. But then we don't have to like duplicate it here and create the animations all over again. The whole point of having a global object is to access all of its behaviors and sprites and things. So instead, what we're going to do, so we still have to download and use the, and this is why I said before that we should, it makes sense for your player character to actually be handled in the player data or stats, player stats or something, some sort of structure for your player, because then no matter where you go, it'll always stay synchronized. But in this particular case, we're going to set it back. So player health will be set to the object life. And then when we create the object, right after we create the object, because in order, right, we have to do this in order, we're going to change, wrong thing, the dino variable. And then we're going to set its health equal to, again, the player data health, right? And that'll work. Now, anytime this character gets hit inside of this logic, we can minus the health and it'll be fine. So now to show you that that worked, we'll start here, press W, and we see now that we're at 2. So that passed through effectively. But now we want to switch our character's behavior between platforming object and the top-down. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new behavior, and we're going to add top-down movement, disable the rotate object again, and now this character has both logics. So what we need to do is in our event scene, when we start the game, we need to disable or enable different elements of our player. So we're going to go to at the beginning of the scene, we're going to click on the dino, and we're going to DE for deactivate. And we're going to deactivate the top-down movement. No. And then we're going to activate the platforming object as yes. And we're going to copy both of these, go into the event sheet at the beginning of the scene. Now we're going to flip it around. No. Yes. So that should now allow us to move around without any interference. And then when we teleport, now change the way we play the game while keeping the sprite and the index all the same. So now, because code doesn't transfer between events, we have to consider what we want accessible in each section of our game. This is where those external events work out really well. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this one out. So Control X, actually, we're going to cut it and paste it. So you can just cut it. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our external events and we're going to add this in. So we're just going to paste that in. So every time the W key is released, we're going to damage the player and then teleport to the map. But this map, we don't want to go to just this one. I want to go back and forth between those two game modes. So how we would do that is we need to add a parental declaration or a statement like we talked about before. And that's a condition. And we're going to drag it up above. And we're going to make this a child of this condition. So we want to check something. And we're going to check if the scene, does scene exist, right? We want to check if this scene exists, right? Or in this particular case, we'll do the untitled scene. So if the untitled scene exists and W key is released, teleport to the new top-down map. And then in this case, we're going to paste it again. And then we're going to say if this scene exists and we press that, we're going to then teleport to the unnamed scene. So now if I was to run this game and to press W in this case, nothing happens because we didn't load the external event. So what we can do now, right, we can get rid of this S. S doesn't do anything for us anymore. And now we have this one condition that's checking for W. So what we can do is right-click on the event, and this is the same thing as right-clicking here and then going to add. So we're just instead going to right-click on add a new event, and we're going to say link external events. Now, always, when we're running the game, link this event, untitled external events. We're going to come into here, and we're going to press, and we're going to go to rename, or F2, and we're going to call this scene transfer, right? Or scene swap. Scene swap, that's fine. Scene swap. We'll double click it, scene swap. Now we're going to say include the events from scene swap. If we go here, and link the external event. We can get scene swap as well. This is a little disorganized comparatively. But now, when we type W, it'll respawn us here. And if we type, and if we go to, so here, if the untitled scene exists and W is released, we're going to trigger this once. And we're going to, I forgot to do this. So what we can do is you can press J on something. So we're going to copy if the scene exists or doesn't exist. So if the scene exists and this one doesn't exist and the W key is pressed, we're going to trigger this one time. So it kind of looks like this, but we're going to break it up in a way that is a little bit more accessible to read. And then here, and just so you know, that is the same thing as clicking this. Pressing J is the same thing, okay? So we're saying if this scene exists and this one doesn't exist, and we're going to do the same thing over here, paste it, click on it, press J, and then we're going to move this up and copy this condition and paste it. So if this scene exists and this one doesn't, transfer. If this scene exists and this one doesn't, transfer. And both of them have a stop other pause scenes. We're going to go back, press this, and we're going to press W. And that's still not going to work, actually, because what's happening is, so this is a great way to use the debugger. I realize what I just did, but I want you to see how I'm going to fix it. So when I press W, nothing happens. Well, if we go into the global variables and go into our dinosaur and click on him, he's got 3 life. And when I press W, it should be subtracting 1 life. That's not working when I release it. And it's because I want to say, I don't need that. Let me look at this again. So we are respawning now, but it's triggering both of them immediately. So what's happening is we're actually changing the game scene and then changing back. So in my mind, I think what we should do is this. Hello? Did I do that right? No, I did not do that right. What do you think about this? I don't know why my brain is struggling on that. If so this should transfer us. It does. And we got hurt. And that triggered once. But what's happening, right, is when I disable this, and we say, we're going to say if this doesn't exist, that's what I should have done. Now we can swap back and forth. Well, we can swap to the game scene. We can't switch out of this because technically this triggers again. Because as soon as this no longer exists and the key is being pressed down, it's going to immediately run that to being true. And it doesn't matter, like, just to show you that the triggers don't need to run in that case. So what we want to do is, let's see here. If the scene exists and it doesn't exist, that should be transferring back, but it's not, because again, this wouldn't make a difference. Yep, we're going to put us in a boot loop. My logic brain here just shut down. I've been programming for like a bunch of hours straight with, like, while talking to you, like, nonstop. So my brain is like, huh? How do we do this? Alex, this is really easy. What are you doing? Okay. Hello. And now we're going to go in a circle. Got it. a very easy way to take care of this without me having to overthink what I'm doing is literally set. This is a great opportunity to exercise another Boolean. I don't know why my brain is struggling with the scene exists and scene doesn't exist, but I want to show you something. So one thing that you can do is we can check the a variable. So if we went to global variables and inside of, let's say, game data, we're not going to keep track of music anymore. Instead, we're going to use a to level, or a level name, or just a level count, right? So level is now going to be a number, and we're going to start with 0. And so we can say that if this scene exists and the variable of the game data level is equal to 0, then do this. And now what we're going to do is change this to 1. And then we're going to here, in the same sort of way that we changed the variable health, we're going to change the game level and set this to 1. And then we will, yeah. And we did full circle again, because what's happening is we're transitioning very quickly, and so I forgot to add holy cow, my brain's gone, boys. This is so simple, and my brain just completely shut off. Maybe that's my brain telling me that we should stop here before I spend 30 minutes sorting through a very basic script, because I'm growing tired, and it's the right thing to do. So rather than wasting all of our time here and me trying to figure out that, I want to pause here. And I think that if you've been following along, this is a great exercise for you to fix my mistake. And I'll show you how to fix this loop logic cycle and why it's always reported to the same. I know exactly why, but my brain isn't working for selecting the right conditions. But what I'm trying to tell you guys is that you have to be careful when you're loading in and out these things, because triggers work, again, not the way that you expect them to, right? We're triggering this one time. You'd think that it would only load, but again, we're turning this on to true, which then disables this to not work. But then as soon as you click the button, this becomes true. And then at the same frame, because again, this is running over multiple frames a second, within 1 second, or in this case, a millisecond, this turns true while this is still registering as true, immediately bumping you back. So you have to put some level of buffer between these two. So if I was to, like, say 0, well, actually, I think that this is a great opportunity to have you guys work on this if you would like to, and then figure out in the next video how that worked. But before I leave you here, there's one thing I said I was going to talk about earlier and I didn't, and I want to go back to it one more time. So going back into our variables, I talked to you about structures and arrays. You see here, when I set this to an array, this went to number 0. Now 0 in the array is equal to 100, which before it was a structure, and this was called health, right? So the difference between a structure and an array, in the simplest sort of way, I want to show you via art. So what happens is an array in the system has brackets that look like this, and a structure looks like this. Hey, Bob. And so here we have the bracket system, right? And this is an array. We know these are arrays. They are not, some people think I say a ray, This is not what I'm saying. I'm saying array. A array. Okay? Not the same thing as saying array, array. And then this is a structure. Okay? So the difference between them is simply the way we organize things. Now, I'm going to explain this like a bookshelf. Okay? This is the best way I've been able to explain this to anyone, and I think that everyone can understand this simple concept. So, here we go. Ready for this? It's going to blow your mind how easy this is. Think of them like a library book stand. The difference between an array and a structure is how we register what's going on in here. All right. So let's say that this is an off-limits part of the library for a moment, and the leader of that is an array. This bookshelf is an array. When we have slot number 1, book number 1, for example, so we're just going to make book number 1 blue. That is not what I wanted. Hello, blue. And then book number 2 to be red. And just for simplicity's sake, we'll do green as well, so we can have some primary color going on here. Okay, so in an array, let's say that book number 1, and I'll do this in blue. Book number 1, and I'm doing this in brackets, so that's what's going on here. The array looks like this: 0, 1, 2. Now each of these have a variable assigned to them. This is an array, so this could be number 0 could be 100, a value. This one, number 1, could be hello, a text. And number 2 could be a true or false Boolean. So in an array, although you can use different variables, each one of these variables, the slot 0, will always be 100. So if I was to, in the array, like if I said move number 0 to the location of number 2. So if I said, hey, take book blue out and move it into the number 2 slot, what would happen is number 1 would shift into 0, the 0 slot. Number 2 would shift into the 1 slot, and 0 would become number 2. So because they're permanent books. So what I want to say is effectively 0 is always this location. So if you take that data and you move it, and then you shrink the data over, it ends up doing this. So now 0, 1, and 2. So the data moves itself to the beginning or end, or you can move it around where you want to, but it becomes the digit location. That's how you access them, is by number. So you'll see this in Gdevelop a lot. And another cool way of showing you a structure, one of my favorite ways visually in Gdevelop to show you, is when we go into an object that we have and we go to the animations, you get to see animation slot 0 is idle, animation slot 1 is crouch. If I grabbed animation 1 and moved it to the first slot, it now becomes animation 0. Because this, no matter where you move it, whatever is in the first number slot is always 0. Whatever is there is always 0. Now, what's really interesting in a visual way is that Gdevelop does something else where it shows you the array and the structure. Okay, this is where it differs, and this is where it becomes hard to explain. If I deleted all of these, there is no title any longer. An array does not have a title. Animation 0, we would just have to know, is idle. But we can name it idle. We can't name a array. We can't name the slots in an array. We can add variables to an array object. So 0 may have a number or a name in a text object. I'm sorry, I got lost in what I was... Oh, back to my art. So when you take a book out, you shift it over, and then all of the other books collapse and fill in the gap. So 0 can never be empty. This will never be empty as long as there's variables inside. It'll always progress in that way. Now, Yeah, sorry, I was reading what Sean had just said. So Sean had asked, so manipulating arrays is how speedrunners and game glitcher and how gamers glitch games, right? It causes slots because slots get bunched and swapped and end up giving unique and strange results. Sometimes players can find ways to break the system to enable weird things to happen, but an array isn't necessarily responsible for that cause. It can be player, they could be their triggers and stuff, but you are kind of right. That is one way that they could potentially break it. But an array, is a storage center. So if the zero array has multiple, like, has values into it, because we could turn the first slot of any array into well, yes, I guess, hold on, let me show you something. A way to call an array in Gdevelop is to wrap something in a bracket and then type the number you want to target. So I want to show you this real fast. So that would look like, let's see here, if an array, yeah, so let's say we're going to change this to an animation. Now, animation by number, by name. So by number, we can set it to animation index of 0, which we know is idle. So always change the animation of the player to idle. Now, if I change this to 1, it'll be crouch. Now, that's an animation array, because that's how Gdevelop reads it. Now, other engines may not read it that way, but that is how Gdevelop structures that. So what's interesting here is that when we check something, let's say we're going to check we're going to change the text of the UI. We're going to always change that text. Good gracious, I cannot speak today. To object dot or underscore dino, and then we're going to go animation. Now we can go index, right? And now this is changing a string. Like it's trying to change. We're using an object animation value, and then we're passing it into toString because we need to convert it that way. But what I want to show you is in the same sort of way that this operates. I have to leave that blank for a second and go into the object. Let's say in our UI, so rather than continuing to mess with the dino variable or the dino character, we're going to create a dialog. Dialog. I don't, what? My brain. Dialog. We're going to turn it into a structure, and we're going to add different children to it. Now, a structure is going to get converted into an array. There we see the numbers change, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Now watch. We can change these to text, for example. And I don't like cheese. Oops. Okay. I don't like cheese. I don't like cheese because I'm lactose intolerant. But I mean, I love cheese. It just doesn't like me. Anyways, I don't like cheese. So if we wanted to target a certain part of the text, and I said UI, so I wanted to target that variable of the array, watch. So if I go to the variable is dialog. So we got to go to target the object, then it's dialog. Now, inside of dialog, we can pass through. We can do it like this. That's true. So dialog.1. So again, remember, every time we add a dot, it steps down the ladder. So every time we add a dot in Gdevelop, I just want to show you. So if we say object, so obj, so whatever our object is, dot, that means the object's behavior or variables. And then so if we're targeting a structure or an array, now we're saying dot array, right? And now an array, and now we're saying dot what number in the array, 1, 0, 1, 2. We always count from 0. In 0 is the first slot. So now what we're saying is object.array.x value. What's the x value? Now, in this case, we're going down 2 steps. Basically, we're going object into array, array.the array index. Now, another way, if you're coming from another programming language that you may have seen this before, is actually to pass it through like this. And that is a way that I'll continue to show you, but this is how you target the array. So this is slot 0 in the array. This effectively, right, is saying in the object dialog of this, or in the this 0 is, I want you to say I. So then if I go over here and run this, we'll see that it's I. And then if I change this to 2, it skipped don't and it went to like, right? So we can target arrays this way. Now the difference between an array and a structure is this. I mean, it's a nuanced difference, but you can treat structures like arrays, and you can even call a structure and say structure number 1 or 0, and it will report true. Because one of the things that you can do, another way that you may have heard structure, is dictionary. Okay, my chicken scratch. Don't worry about it. So a dictionary, right? So another way of hearing this is a dictionary. So what I want to show you is the difference between the two is that although you can still call structure 0, as in the first slot, you can do that if you just want to know whatever's always in the first slot. But what a structure allows you to do is, let's say that green is Moby Dick as a book, blue, this one should be 1, this one should be 0, and then this one will be 3 in the array. So like if this is an array, this is what it would look like, right? So this one is Peter Pan, and then 3 is, we'll call it Spider-Man. Okay, so Moby Dick, Peter Pan, Spider-Man, whatever. Because this book, green book, even though it starts at 0, is Moby Dick, it has a title. It has a variable title, a string title. So what happens is if you take 0, 1, and, or, 0, 1, and 2, sorry, I don't know why I put 3 here. This is confusing. This should be 2, okay? 0, 1, 2. If I took Moby Dick and moved it over here, although it would do the exact same thing, but the title would actually shift with it. And the importance of that is naming convention. So even though if I moved it in the structure, 3 would now be Moby Dick. Moby Dick doesn't lose any of its... You can position it anywhere in the bookshelf and call it by its title. So now it no longer cares about those numbers. And so a cool way of showing you that inside of Gdevelop is going back into what we're currently doing here, right? Going back into the UI, and we're going to go instead, as we're going to go into the UI debugger here, go into the variables, and now we can change this into a structure, right? Now we can name this as like part 1, part 2, or part 0, I guess. But so what I'm saying is now part 0 exists. It's no longer in the array as 0. So we'd have to call it as whatever we wanted to call it. So this one could be, what you wouldn't like cheese, whatever. But cheese, and then like, as you can see, it's reorganizing them. So part 0, it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 4th one in the array. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But now it's at, it's at the bottom. So the way to visually see this is actually back into the character. So inside of the character object, we have the animation 0, but it's called idle. It's called idle. So now, as long as, going back into here, what we're going to say is we're going to change when we load into this event. Let's see here. Let me think about this. Yeah, okay. When we load in the game scene and we're inside of the top down, we're going to trigger in the one-time event only a transitional change to the animation. So again, animation by number, animation by name. If we wanted to transition to the animation by name, idle, right? But we can actually use the expression. Now it's wrapped in those quotes. It's the same thing. There's a drop down menu, or you can use an expression. And so now it's looking for the animation of the title to set it to the title of idle, set it to the title of crouch. You see how it's in quotes? It's targeting it no matter where you put it. So this will work, right? In the same way as, hello? Oh, that's idle. Yeah, let's go to crouch to change it. So now it's crouched, right? But now, yeah, yeah. So instead of using very specific titles in a string, you can use numbers to access things in an array. Yep, that's true. However, you need to know that those numbers change because, again, going back into, so let's say that animation of crouch, right? That's a title. So let's go back into our dyno. Crouch is number 1, but no matter where I put crouch, I'm going to put it now at the number 1 slot, and we're going to preview this. It's still going to be crouched because we're targeting via the title, the name tag of that variable. This would be the same thing in a programming language as saying that a variable of your definition. So this would be the same thing as saying, let's say, hello? Where are you? Okay, there we go. So let's say that you have a variable and you're going to call it player equals. That's a variable. So this is a variable. It is a generic variable that you are telling it to be what? What type of variable is it? Well, it depends on you. You could say it's a string or a text, or you could say it's a number, or you could say it's true or false, right? So now those are built into, those are semantic components to the language that you're trying to speak. And in this case, you can title this and move it about. But now, if I was to go to by number, just to show you this now, we did animation crouch. Yep, it's crouched. But then if I change this to by number, and we lose the index because it now needs to be an actual number, 0 is the first one, and 0 is crouch. But then if I go back into the object and I change idle to 0, now I'll be idling. And that's kind of a visual way to show you the difference between how dictionaries and how arrays work. A dictionary you can always call by its title, or a structure can always be called by its title, whereas an array, you have to target the number. The number, and those numbers are perpetual, infinite. So every time you add something to it, it adds to the end of the array. So let's say you were making an inventory system, for example. So now we're going to get rid of this and we're going to talk about an inventory system. So an inventory system, if it was a modern inventory system, imagine that we're playing Diablo, or a game like Diablo. Minecraft is another great example of how this inventory would work. So let's say that we have boxes for our gear in terms of trying to organize items. If you are using an array, then this would be slot 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Whenever you pick something up, it will go into that slot. Now, let's say you said you have in your game, right? So this is kind of, in some degree, it's not the same thing, but in some degree, imagine that you are playing Minecraft, and now you have your game slots on the bottom. Slot 1, okay, slot 2, and it's going to go on with how many ever you can hold in your hand or whatever. So let's say we bound in an array 0 to this slot, 1 to this slot, 2 to this slot. That means that, let's say in order of our items, we have a potion, a sword, and a bow. Okay? So now our bow is in slot 2, 1, 0. Now, because this is 0, and this is 1, and this is, that one looks like a 2, that's a 1, and then this is a 2, 3. So what would happen is whatever's in this slot would always be in slot number 0. And then so let's say if we move the potion to slot number 2, and then bow would now be slot number 0, bow. So no matter what is here in the array, it will always report as the first one there. Now, if this was a dictionary, now you can use an array for counting your blocks. So slot number 0 should always report whatever's in slot number 0. So if you take an item from here and move it to there, then change its value to whatever that is. But if you wanted this to these blocks, so these blocks are named this way, so 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. But let's say instead, when you create your inventory, these blocks don't have an ID. These blocks are not 1 or are not 0, 1, 2. They're not that. Instead, they're nothing. They have no ID. They're just instant variables. So this one would be a random number. This one would be a random number, and so on and so forth, that are not related to this. You could then say, even if this is in slot 0, it's called bow. Then you would say, if bow is selected, assign it to slot 1 or assign it to slot 3, because these are irrelevant because we're using a structure, we're summoning it. So if the title of this slot is bow, so what I would say in an inventory is that this is bow. So if this slot is bow because it's holding the item or string of bow, when I press G to drop it onto the ground, you're dropping a bow on the ground and not dropping a 0 on the ground. Does that make sense? Or a 0 like this. Because 0 would be whatever's in this slot, but bow would be wherever the bow is and selected, drop it. So doing it this way allows you to move items in your inventory yeah, Sean, that's a great example. So now that's just a mathematical sort of thing, but you wouldn't need, so we're going to go over real quick to explain, Sean just said something awesome in chat. So just to reinforce what they're saying is, so for instance, if you wanted to make a tree, right? Your game tree, we're just going to do a little tree, right? Little tree. If you want your tree to grow up over time, then you would set the timer by, or you want to set the animations that trigger by a timer adding +1 to the animation array every so often. So yeah, I mean, you could use by number. So you could say if you're growing plants in a game, say that we're playing Stardew Valley or something, you have your plant, right? This is your little crop. And let's say that when you first plant it, right, it's a seed. So an animation can be, this would be 0 and then again 1, right? And so maybe this one has like leaves coming out of it. And then number 2 has like, I think you guys probably get the picture here, but just in case, we'll make sure that this stem, he's got like a little leaf down here. And now that's number 2, right? So, and then this is 3. So let's say there are 3 stages, or in this case, 4, but we talked about this again. So programming 0, 1, 2. So stage 0 is the initial state, the beginning, the baby state, and then we have initial +1 for each time. So what you could do in Gdevelop is say, for example, at the start, let's say whenever you plant the seed. So once the seed is planted, so when the condition of, we're just going to call a global variable. We're going to pretend that this is an object, right? So we're going to say variable, and we're going to create a new one, and we're going to say if the let me think on the top of it. Okay, we're going to pretend like this is a object. So we're going to call this object, just to make it clear. Object dot, we'll say growth stage 0. Okay, object.growth stage. So if it is equal to 0, which is the beginning state, we're going to start a timer. So start or reset the timer. And this isn't an object, we're going to do a scene timer. And if it was an object, like we had a tree or a tree object, we would use the object timer. But because we're using a scene timer, you could do it this way too. And the scene timer will be object. Well, we're going to call this one growth. Okay, so the timer that we're going to start is growth. So whenever it hits 0, start the growth. Now what we want to do is we're going to check if the growth is, well, I guess it doesn't even matter. So now we're going to check if the timer, so now we're going to type timer. And again, we have to select a scene timer. If the value, scene timer, of growth is greater than or equal to 5, let's say every 5 seconds. If it's greater than or equal to 5 multiplied by times delta, because that means if it's 5 seconds of your computer's frames, not the engine's frames. So times delta is if you have a slower computer or something, if the growth is 5 seconds times your delta multiplier in seconds. So 5 times 60 frames a second. For whatever your current computer is. So 5 times the 5 seconds you want times however many time deltas we have to rotate through effectively. Then what we're going to do is trigger that event of growth stage. So then variable. So pretending that this is an object, we're going to say then the growth stage is equal to 2. Or we're going to add 1. Sorry, we're going to add 1. So now every time that growth resets, we're going to add 1. And now what I'm going to do to make this visible is we're going to just set the object.growth stage to the debugger. So we can see now that whenever we start, it should start counting over into the our growth timer. And I'm actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we shouldn't need to use time delta here, now that I'm thinking about it. Oh, that is why. So we want to trigger this one time. This is really important because what was happening is every time the growth stage is equal to, and I am going to actually put back times delta just to make sure that I'm on the right track. I think, let me see here. So now whenever it equals 0, one time, trigger this, start it. If it equals stage 1, right, reset it. And so what we're going to do is add 1 to the growth rate, and then we're going to restart it. And then now it's perpetually going. And we can see that happening. Now, we want to make sure that we're greater than equal to 5 seconds times time delta. We want to reset this because you don't want to do times delta, or it's going to, as you saw, rip across the game screen. Sorry. So basically I was multiplying by a fraction, which is making this super small. You wouldn't want to do it on a timer. You want to do it on a weight axis. You don't want to use a wait 5 seconds. Then you have to do times delta. Instead, when you do a timer, every 5 seconds, the growth stage will change. So that's pretty easy because now what we would do is say, okay, we would then create a statement of if the object is 1, if the object is 2, and we can change those animations. And this is how we would do it. So whenever it reaches this stage, trigger that once, trigger that once. So then at stage 1, all we would say is go to the, and we're going to use the dinosaur as a great example. You can go to animation by number and just simply say add 1 to the index. So every time we transition, if we go into 1, trigger this to add 1. If we go into this, trigger this to add 1. We could set it to 1 or set it to 2, and that'd be a fine way of doing that. Another way we could do this is simply just add it to here. So every time we reset, we can reduce all of that clutter and now just say every time that we grow a stage, change the animation by 1. And then we can say if the growth timer is at its maximum and the object is greater than or equal to the highest number we can go to. Say there's 4 growth stages. In this case, we would write 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. We would set this growth stage to nothing, and then we would do no more. And we just reset the timer. And so, or at that rate, we could literally stop the timer instead, because we don't need the timer anymore. So we'll delete a scene timer, and then we'll say delete growth. So here we are. Every time it resets, but once growth stage is greater than or equal to 3, delete the timer. So here we go. We're going to watch it go. And every time it counts over, we should see the player change in animation. Time waiting, 2, and now we're matching it. Time waiting, 3, and now it changed the animation to this kick. This is going to... That should not have happened. Hello? We recycled. Delete the growth timer. What did I do here? Start. Oh. And is less than 3. Okay, there we go. So now it should not allow me to go further than that. So let's watch that happen, and then I'll read what you said in just a second. Okay. And sorry, there we saw that it won't calculate anymore, right? And now it's reporting 3 because that was the last stage that it was set to. And we can now say that after we delete this, set the debugger to nothing. Like literally leave it empty, which is just a blank string like that. So now we'll see it one more time. We'll start at 0. Growth stage number 1. Growth stage number 2. And now we'll go into growth stage number 3. Now wait 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now it's actually just resetting. Because wait, why is that happening? Set this to 0. Oh, it's because this is constantly running, right? Because this is constantly running, we're setting it, we can't overwrite it because it's constantly running. So as long as the growth stage isn't above 3, then report it to this, and then when it is, otherwise set it to 0. So, or set it to nothing. And then we'll see it go to 0, and then there it's gone. So we now that is all working. So now I'm gonna spend just a second here commenting on what Sean said, and then I'll be jumping off for the evening, guys. So let's take a look here. If you did a string, you would have to write it out, all the different stages and their animation names. And if you had like 50 animations in the sequence, you would have to a ladder of number equals animation name. So you wouldn't need to do that in Gdevelop because of this feature right here. This is actually a structure. So idle is, although it is technically animation 0 currently, you can transition between 2 different variables. So you can literally say if dino animation is equal to true. So if the animation of the dinosaur is currently equal to idle, and then do something. So if it's currently equal to idle, then we can change the animation from dyno animation to another one. Let's say sneak, right? So if in this one the object is ever equal to idle, which it is in the very first one, change it to sneak instead. So we'll see, boom, it's sneak, and then it'll go +1, so it's actually going to go to idle. Or, oh no, because we set it to, that's hilarious, actually. So because we're intersecting with two different types of changing of an animation, right? So we're saying change the animation of the number, add 1, and then we're saying effectively here, if the animation is idle, constantly change it over to sneak. We can say, we can do this once while true. And then we'll still see it go into sneak, but because we set it into idle, quote unquote idle, it now is stuck in idle. It doesn't matter what we do to change its number animation, it won't change because we've declared a variable of we did an animation, we called it if the animation is idle. And because idle is in the 0 slot, so if I moved idle out to crouch, now watch, now it'll go from crouch +1, which happens to be idle, but then it snapped out of idle and went into sneak. And now when we do +1, it broke the cycle. So you can't interact, you can't use them at the same time. You have to kind of pick and choose which version you want to do. Because once you've changed it to this was true, now this is constantly going. Although the animation by number is changing, this one is taking priority over because, again, it's checking it down. It's still textually saying it's an idle, but then it's also saying go to +1, but then go back to idle because idle has been pre-selected. So you have to choose which version of this you want to use. Do you want to use it in the structure format, or do you want to use it in the array format? And that's ultimately up to you to decide. So at the beginning of the scene, text the animation to 0, which is crouch. And then because it's not idle, when we do that first rotation of +1 in the growth cycle, it changes. Like we're not really changing the animation at all. We're telling it here, every time we grow up a stage, change the number by 1. But we're not currently running by 1 because we set it to 0, and then it's technically 0, and that's the same thing as doing this at the same time. So let's say now we go to 0, which is crunch. So we're setting the animation title here. And once 0 is reached, which technically is the 1 in the array currently, this takes priority because we're declared it as a structure. Why it does it like that, I'm not entirely sure. But this is technically doing the same thing, but then we rotate it tracking from numbers to strings, and you'd have to convert it again back to a number for this to continue to work. So if you're going to be using arrays and number structures, keep it consistent all the way through. But again, the difference between them is the way that data is stored. So if, yeah, of course, no problem, man. Hopefully that was super helpful to everyone. If you are checking it out for the first time, do give us, slap that follow button, please. Gdevelop is an incredibly easy and intuitive program to learn from, as long as you're willing to tinker. So I highly suggest that all of you get an opportunity to jump in here and get your hands dirty and get to work. I would say this is the beginning of my new tutorial series. There will be a second half to this where we start delving even further into more complex expressions, things like extensions and how to use them in Gdevelop. So this was a in-depth course into more or less how variables work and how to start structuring your code. So tune in next time. You can follow my tweets or check out in the stream category when I'll be online next. But mostly you'll see me live on Discord almost 24/7. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, join our Discord server at the Level Up Society. We have a lot of cool people in there. Other industry professionals have been working in the games industry for some time, editors and voice actors and actresses. We have a whole host of people that are super interested in game development in every category and every component of game development. So hopefully you can get your answers answered there, or I'm always there for help. And if you really like to stream, maybe you support me on Ko-Fi. You can check it out at ko-fi and do it at Level Up with Alex. So until next time, whenever and wherever you are, thank you, my friends. And remember, happy game making. And I'll see you in the next